There is a man standing alone in a field in Scotland. It is the late hours of the 10th of May 1941. The air is cold, the countryside is dark and quiet, interrupted only by the distant sound of dogs and the creak of a farmhouse door swinging open. The man has just fallen from the sky. He is dressed in a Luftwaffe flight suit, his parachute collapsed around him in the grass, and he is asking, in broken English, to speak with the Duke of Hamilton. He is not a spy, he is not a defector in the conventional sense. He is Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, and he has just flown, alone, more than 1,000 kilometers across enemy airspace in a single-engine fighter aircraft, without orders, without backup, and without any real guarantee that the man he is flying to meet even knows he is coming. The British Home Guard soldier staring back at him has no idea what to make of any of this. Neither, it turns out, does the rest of the world. There are stories from the Second World War that arrive pre-packaged with moral clarity. The liberations, the sieges, the moments when courage showed itself in the open and history moved forward because someone refused to give ground. Those stories are vital, and they deserve to be told. But there is another category of story, quieter, stranger, and in some ways more revealing, where the clarity evaporates entirely, where you find yourself looking at a man who was undeniably complicit in one of history's greatest crimes, who held enormous power and chose to use it in service of a monstrous regime, and yet whose final act of consequence was so bizarre, so self-defeating, so profoundly disconnected from any rational calculation of risk or reward, that it still reads, more than 80 years later, like something borrowed from a spy novel that an editor would have rejected as too improbable. Rudolf Hess is one of those stories. He was there at the very beginning, not on the margins, not as a footnote, but at the center, in the rooms where the ideology was being formed, in the prisons where the plans were being written, at the rallies where the crowds were being gathered. He was Hitler's shadow, his amplifier, his loyalist-in-chief. When the Nazi Party needed a man who believed without question, without calculation, without the self-interested hesitations that corrupted even the most committed fanatics, it had Rudolf Hess. He did not build the Third Reich the way an architect builds a structure, with design and distance and professional detachment. He built it the way a man builds something for someone he loves, with devotion, with sacrifice, with a willingness to subordinate his own identity entirely to another person's vision. And then, on a cold night in May 1941, he got into a plane and flew away, and the regime he had spent 20 years constructing went on without him, barely pausing to register his absence. That is the heart of this story. Not just the flight, though the flight is extraordinary enough on its own terms, but everything that led to it, and everything that came after. The trajectory of a man who rose from a middle-class childhood in Alexandria, Egypt, through the violence and confusion of post-war Germany, through the beer halls and the prison cells and the rally grounds, all the way to the upper echelons of the most destructive political movement of the 20th century, and then threw it all away, on a mission that had almost no chance of succeeding, driven by a logic that very few people around him shared or even understood. What do you do with a man like that? He is not a hero. His crimes, crimes of complicity, crimes of ideology, crimes of enthusiastic participation in the machinery of oppression, are real and documented. The Nuremberg tribunal was not wrong about him, but he is also not a simple villain. Simple villains do not fly solo across enemy territory in the middle of a war to try and stop that war. Simple villains do not spend 46 years in a prison cell long after everyone else has been executed or released, simply because the four powers responsible for his incarceration cannot agree on what to do with him. Simple villains do not die in a garden shed, in their 90s, still technically a prisoner of the Second World War, a war that had ended more than 4 decades earlier. Rudolf Hess is something more uncomfortable than a simple villain. He is a mirror. He reflects back at us the capacity of ordinary intelligence, ordinary ambition, and even ordinary idealism to be captured, corrupted, and redirected toward catastrophic ends. He was not a stupid man. He was not an obviously cruel one, not in the way that some of those around him wore their cruelty openly. He was, by many accounts, soft-spoken, devoted to his family, genuinely convinced that what he was doing was right, and he was wrong. Catastrophically, historically, irredeemably wrong. That combination, intelligence plus devotion plus profound moral error, is one of the most dangerous things that human nature produces. And it is one of the most important things to understand about how the world breaks when it does. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour you have carved out for yourself, that is what we are going to explore together. The complete history of Rudolf Hess, from Alexandria to Spandau, from the beer halls of Munich to the courtroom at Nuremberg, from the man who stood at Hitler's right hand to the ghost who outlasted the regime he helped create by more than 4 decades. This is a long one. It is meant to be. These stories do not compress well, and they should not be asked to. The life of Rudolf Hess is nearly a century long, and it touches nearly every major turning point of the 20th century's darkest chapter. So settle in, get comfortable, let the details wash over you at whatever pace your night allows. If you drift off somewhere over the Scottish Highlands at 20,000 feet, that is exactly where this story wants you to be. And if you find yourself wanting more stories like this one, told this way, at this length, at this hour, then take a moment before you close your eyes to subscribe. Every story we tell here is built for exactly this kind of night. The ones where sleep comes slowly, and the mind wants something to hold on to while it lets go of the day. This is the story of Rudolf Hess. It begins not in Germany, not in a bunker or a courtroom, but in the heat and light of Alexandria, Egypt, at the turn of the 20th century, a world away, in every sense, from where it ends. The Mediterranean light falls differently in Alexandria. It lands flat and white on whitewashed walls, on the busy harbour fronts, on the faces of merchants and sailors and diplomats who have come from somewhere else and never quite left. It was into this particular world, ordered, prosperous, and thoroughly German in its domestic arrangements, that Rudolf Walter Richard Hess was born on the 26th of April, 1894. His father, Johann Fritz Hess, was a wholesale merchant of considerable standing, a man who had built his commercial life along the Egyptian coast and who believed, with the conviction that only the self-made carry, that discipline and structure were the foundations of everything worth having. The household reflected this belief. It was formal, dutiful, and emotionally cool in the way that prosperous German households of that era often were, where love was expressed through provision rather than tenderness. Young Rudolf grew up between worlds, between the ancient heat of Egypt and the cultural gravity of the German nation his family never stopped orienting toward. He was, in this sense, a citizen of somewhere he had never truly been. His early childhood was shaped by the rhythms of colonial merchant life, Arabic spoken in the streets below, German spoken at the dinner table above, and between these two registers, a boy who absorbed both, but belonged fully to neither. The Hess family maintained their German identity with a certain fierceness common to expatriates who fear that distance will dilute what they value most. Rudolf attended a German school in Alexandria, absorbing the curriculum of the Wilhelmina era, the history of Prussian military glory, the romanticism of German national identity, the idea that Germany was something exceptional in the world, and that belonging to it was its own form of honor. He was a quiet student, not brilliant in the conventional academic sense, but attentive, earnest, and possessed of a quality that his teachers noted and that would mark him throughout his life, an almost total inability to question authority he had chosen to respect. He was sent back to Germany for his secondary schooling at the age of 14, to Bad Godesberg on the Rhine, severed from the Egyptian world of his childhood and planted into the grey discipline of the German boarding school tradition. It was an abrupt transplant, and he bore it with the stiff endurance his father would have expected. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, Rudolf Hess did not hesitate. He enlisted, as so many young Germans did, in the flush of something that felt, in those first weeks, almost like joy. He served on the Western Front with the List Regiment, the same regiment, though they would not know each other there, that a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler was also serving in at that time. Hess fought with genuine courage. He was wounded multiple times, returning to the front after each recovery with a determination that had nothing theatrical about it. By the time the war's final years arrived, and the Western Front had become an industrialized slaughterhouse without precedent in human experience, he had transferred to the Imperial German Flying Corps, training as a pilot in the closing months of the conflict. He never flew in combat before the armistice came, and in that gap, between the training he had completed and the mission he never flew, there was perhaps the first of many frustrations that would accumulate across his life. He had prepared himself for something and arrived too late to use what he had built. Then Germany lost, and the world that Rudolf Hess had been prepared for, the ordered, hierarchical, martial world that his father's certainties and his school's curriculum had promised him, simply stopped existing. The armistice of November 1918 did not feel, to men like Hess, like the end of a war. It felt like a theft. The front lines had not collapsed. They had been abandoned, or so the story went. The story that would prove so catastrophically durable. The Dolchstoss Legende, the stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany had been betrayed from within by socialists and Jews and weak-willed civilians, was not an idea that filtered slowly into Hess. It was an idea that arrived already formed, already believed, because men like Hess needed it to be true. The alternative, that Germany had simply been outmatched, outlasted, and exhausted, was not an explanation that his psychological architecture could accommodate. He came home from the war into a country that looked like the country he had left, but felt like a foreign place. The Weimar Republic that emerged from the rubble of Imperial Germany was, by any objective measure, one of the most turbulent political experiments in modern European history. In the years immediately following the armistice, Germany experienced revolutionary uprisings from the left, violent suppression from the right, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, and a political culture so fractured that violence had become simply another form of argument. Into this chaos stepped the Freikorps, irregular paramilitary units composed largely of demobilized veterans who could not or would not return to civilian life. Hess joined them. The Freikorps were not a single organization, but a constellation of armed bands, some semi-official, some entirely private, united mainly by their hostility to the Weimar government and their willingness to use force. For Hess, membership was not purely ideological at first. It was practical, communal, and familiar. It gave him back the structure and the brotherhood that the war had provided and the armistice had taken away. The Freikorps operated across Germany and in disputed border regions, fighting against communist uprisings, suppressing strikes, and generally functioning as the violent edge of right-wing political ambition. Hess participated in these activities with the same earnest commitment he had brought to everything else. He was not a thug by temperament. He was too quiet, too inward for that. But he was a true believer in the cause, and that belief made him capable of things that his Alexandria childhood would never have predicted. The violence of the Freikorps era was not abstract to its participants. It was close and physical, and often arbitrary, but for men who had survived the Western Front, the threshold for what counted as extraordinary had been permanently raised. Hess moved through this period without apparent moral crisis, which tells us something important about the formation already underway inside him. Munich in the early 1920s was a city in the grip of something approaching collective derangement. The Bavarian capital had become the epicenter of right-wing political agitation in Germany, drawing veterans, nationalists, mystics, anti-Semites, and opportunists into a dense and combustible political atmosphere. The hyperinflation that consumed Germany's middle class in 1923, reducing savings accumulated over lifetimes to figures barely sufficient to buy a loaf of bread, produced a fury that had no obvious political outlet, and every demagogue in Munich was competing to channel it. It was here, in this city of lost certainties, that Hess began attending lectures and meetings that would determine the rest of his life. He enrolled at Munich University, studying economics and history, but the education that actually formed him was happening elsewhere, in the beer halls and assembly rooms where a new kind of political performance was taking shape. He also came under the influence of Professor Karl Haushofer, a geopolitician at the University of Munich, whose theories about Lebensraum, living space, and the geographical destiny of nations would leave visible traces in the ideological architecture of National Socialism. Haushofer was not a crude propagandist. He was an academic of genuine standing, and his ideas gave the raw resentments of the nationalist movement a veneer of intellectual respectability. Hess absorbed these ideas with the uncritical appetite of a young man who has been waiting for a framework that makes his anger coherent. Haushofer, in turn, treated Hess with something approaching paternal warmth, and this relationship between the credentialed thinker and the ardent disciple would shape how Hess understood himself for years to come. He was not simply a brawler or a party functionary. He was, in his own mind, a man of ideas. It was in Munich that Hess first heard Adolf Hitler speak. The precise occasion is not recorded with certainty, but the effect was not in doubt. Hitler's oratory in those early years was something that defies easy retrospective analysis, because to understand its power, you must strip away everything you know about what it would eventually produce, and try to hear it as the men and women in those rooms heard it, as something electric and clarifying, a voice that seemed to give shape to a grief and rage that had been formless. For Hess, it was not merely persuasion, it was recognition. Here was a man saying, in public, with terrifying fluency, everything that Hess had felt but never been able to articulate. The response was not intellectual. It was closer to devotion, and devotion, once kindled in a man like Hess, did not negotiate with doubt. By the time the early 1920s gave way to the mid-decade, Hess had completed the journey that began in Alexandria. He was no longer the merchant's son shaped by colonial comfort and the Wilhelmine certainties of his father's world. He was a political animal in the most volatile city in Germany, a veteran who had found in the nationalist movement something that felt like purpose and belonging combined. The hyperinflation crisis that destroyed middle-class Germany in 1923 radicalized men by the millions, and Hess was among them, though perhaps radicalized is not quite the right word, because it implies a before and after that his trajectory does not quite support. More accurate to say that he was completed by this moment, that the chaos around him filled in the shape that his upbringing and his war experience had already carved. Munich had done its work. The boy from Alexandria was gone. In his place was something harder and considerably more dangerous. What emerged from those years was not a cynical operator, not a man who had calculated the odds and chosen the winning side. That is what makes Rudolf Hess genuinely difficult to account for. He was a true believer, in the most complete sense, a man whose faith in Hitler was not strategy or self-interest dressed up as ideology, but something closer to a conversion experience that had rearranged every priority in his life. That absolute quality of his belief would carry him to extraordinary heights within the movement that was still, in these early years, a fringe of malcontents in a Bavarian city. It would later carry him much further than that, and it would ultimately carry him somewhere he could never have imagined, alone, in the cockpit of a single aircraft, over the dark water of the North Sea, heading toward a country that was not interested in what he had to offer. Munich, in the early 1920s, was not a city at peace with itself. It was a city fermenting, thick with grievance, loud with argument, and haunted by the memory of a war that had ended not in glory, but in humiliation. The cafes along the Maximilianstrasse buzzed with veterans who could not understand how an undefeated army had been brought to its knees by politicians, by traitors, by forces they could not quite name, but were more than willing to blame. Newspapers printed in the morning were worthless by afternoon, not because the news had changed, but because the inflation had eaten the paper's value before the ink had dried. Into this city, still raw and disoriented, came Rudolf Hess, a young man with a sharp jaw, deep-set eyes that seemed always to be searching for something just beyond the horizon, and a burning need to make sense of a world that appeared to be collapsing around him. He had survived the trenches. He had fought in the skies. He had come home to find that home no longer meant what it once had. Munich, for all its chaos, felt like the right place to rebuild a self that the war had cracked open. He enrolled at the University of Munich, pursuing studies in economics and political science, disciplines that seemed almost darkly comic given the state of the German economy at the time. But Hess was not there merely to study. He was there to absorb, to listen, to find the current that was running beneath the surface of everything. He attended lectures with the same focused intensity he had brought to aerial combat, head slightly forward, jaw set, as though the world owed him a clear answer. His professors found him earnest to the point of rigidity, a young man who had already decided what he believed and was now searching for the intellectual scaffolding to support it. He was drawn to theories of geopolitics, particularly to the ideas of Karl Haushofer, a professor and former general who spoke about land, power, and the destiny of nations in terms that seemed to give shape to the formless anger Hess carried inside him. Haushofer's concept of Lebensraum, living space, would become one of the foundational ideas of National Socialism, and it was through Hess that this academic theory would eventually find its way into the highest levels of Nazi ideology. At the same time, Hess was pursuing another education entirely, one conducted not in lecture halls but in beer halls, street corners, and the back rooms of nationalist clubs. Munich in these years was a breeding ground for political movements of every extremist stripe, and a young man with Hess's background, military service, Freikorps connections, A deep and personal sense of national betrayal was exactly the kind of recruit these movements were hunting. He attended meetings, listened to speakers, argued through the night with fellow veterans who shared his conviction that Germany had been stabbed in the back by forces within its own borders. The language at these gatherings was rough, repetitive, and emotionally overwhelming in the way that simple explanations for complex disasters always are. Hess drank it in. He was, by temperament, a follower in search of a leader, a man whose considerable intelligence was always more comfortable being directed than directing. It was in this context that he first heard Adolf Hitler speak. The exact occasion is not recorded with precision, but the effect was recorded in everything Hess subsequently wrote and said. Hitler, in these years, was already a phenomenon in Munich's nationalist circles, a former Austrian corporal with no formal education and no social standing, who nonetheless commanded a room the way a fire commands a winter night. He did not argue his points so much as perform them, pacing, gesturing, his voice rising and falling in waves that seemed to find the emotional frequency of everyone in the room simultaneously. For Hess, who had spent his adult life looking for someone with the certainty he himself lacked, the encounter was something close to religious. He began attending Nazi Party meetings with increasing regularity, drawn back again and again, not so much by the specific content of Hitler's speeches, as by the man's absolute, unshakable conviction that he was right about everything. Hess also continued his flying during these Munich years, maintaining the skill and the discipline that had defined his wartime service. The airfields around Munich gave him a space that the political world could not, a place where competence was measured in clean, objective terms, where the machine either flew or it didn't, where skill had a purity that ideology could never quite replicate. His instructors noted his natural aptitude, his coolness under pressure, and his almost obsessive attention to the mechanical details of his aircraft. Flying was, for Hess, a form of control in a life that otherwise felt controlled by forces far larger than himself. It also gave him a social circle that straddled the military and the civilian worlds. Men who had flown in the war, who understood what it meant to risk everything on a single decision made at altitude, and who were just as hungry as he was for a Germany that made sense again. By 1922, Hess had formally joined the Nazi Party. He was not yet a figure of any particular importance within it, but he was useful, educated, articulate, capable of translating Hitler's raw emotional energy into something approaching coherent political language. He began writing for Nazi publications, attending rallies, and making himself indispensable in the small, grinding administrative work that keeps any political movement alive between its moments of drama. He was also, by this point, entirely devoted to Hitler in a way that went beyond ordinary political allegiance. He spoke of the man with a reverence that unnerved even some of his fellow Nazis, as though Hitler were not merely a political leader, but something more fundamental, a historical force, a correction to all that had gone wrong. The year 1923 brought Germany to its worst crisis since the armistice. The French occupation of the Ruhr industrial region in January of that year triggered a campaign of passive resistance that the German government financed by printing money at a rate that made the word inflation almost comically inadequate. By autumn, a single loaf of bread cost what a comfortable middle-class salary had bought before the war. Wheelbarrows of banknotes were exchanged for groceries. Savings that families had accumulated over generations were erased in weeks. The middle class, which had survived the war and the revolution, found itself suddenly and bewilderingly impoverished. The rage this produced was not abstract, it was visceral, personal, and looking desperately for somewhere to land. Hitler and the Nazi Party believed they had found their moment. On the night of the 8th of November 1923, Hitler and a group of armed supporters stormed a meeting at the Bürger Bräukeller, a large beer hall in Munich, where the Bavarian State Commissioner was addressing a gathering of senior government officials. Hitler fired a pistol into the ceiling, declared a national revolution, and attempted to seize control of the Bavarian government as a first step toward marching on Berlin and overthrowing the Weimar Republic. The putsch was a chaotic, poorly coordinated affair, the kind of event that looks decisive in the moment and disastrous in retrospect. By the following afternoon, it had collapsed entirely, dispersed by police gunfire near the Feldherrnhalle, the classical monument at the heart of Munich. Hess was not among the marchers at the Feldherrnhalle. His precise movements on those 2 days have been the subject of careful historical scrutiny, and the picture that emerges is of a man who was nearby, who was aware of what was being attempted, but who did not play a central role in the putsch itself. What he did do, in the confused aftermath, was involve himself in the detention of several Bavarian government officials, an act that would later be used against him at Nuremberg as evidence of his early willingness to participate in lawless political violence. But in the immediate chaos of the failed coup, Hess was a secondary figure, present, complicit in the atmosphere if not the action, and watching as the movement he had committed himself to suffered its most humiliating defeat. The failure of the beer hall putsch might easily have ended the Nazi Party. It might equally have ended Rudolf Hess's connection to it, giving him a rational reason to step back and reconsider. It did neither. Hitler was arrested and tried for treason, sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, a sentence that would ultimately last less than 14 months, and the experience of that trial, rather than destroying him, transformed him into a national figure. Hess, arrested shortly afterward, chose to return voluntarily to German soil and face whatever charges awaited him, rather than remain free in Austria. It was not a decision born of calculation. It was a decision born of loyalty, the same loyalty that would define his life for the next 2 decades and ultimately consume it. When Hess arrived at Landsberg prison and was placed in the same facility as Hitler, something happened that would shape the course of both men's lives and, through them, the course of European history. Hess did not simply serve his sentence alongside his leader. He became, in that confined space, Hitler's amanuensis, his sounding board, his most attentive audience. Hitler dictated and argued and theorized, and Hess listened, transcribed, questioned, and organized. The book that emerged from those prison months, the manifesto that would become the foundational text of National Socialism, passed through Hess's hands more intimately than almost anyone else's. He was not its author, but he was present at its creation in a way that made him, from that point forward, something more than a follower. He was a participant in the founding myth of the movement, and that participation would bind him to it with a force that no subsequent doubt, no subsequent disillusionment, no subsequent catastrophe would ever fully break. By the mid-1920s, Rudolf Hess had already charted a course through violence, failure, and political awakening that left him searching for something to anchor himself to. The beer hall putsch had collapsed into farce. The Freikorps had dissolved into memory. Germany itself seemed caught in a slow, grinding humiliation. Currency worthless, institutions hollowed out, the old certainties of Kaiser and Empire reduced to rubble. Men like Hess, who had fought in the trenches and come home to nothing, needed a cause that matched the scale of their grievance. They needed someone who could articulate that grievance with the force of a thunderclap. When Hess found Adolf Hitler, It was not the encounter of a cynical opportunist climbing toward power. It was something closer to devotion, immediate, total, and, in the end, irreversible. His formal entry into the Nazi Party, recorded in the late 1920s, was less a political calculation than a homecoming. Hess had been orbiting Hitler's world for years already, attending meetings, listening to speeches, absorbing the particular intoxication of a movement that blamed everything and promised everything in equal measure. But formalizing that commitment marked a shift. He was no longer a curious young nationalist passing through Munich's beer hall circuit. He was now a man with a function, a man with a desk, a man whose entire purpose was to serve another man's vision. For Hess, this was not diminishment, it was purpose. And purpose, after the drifting years of the early 20s, felt like oxygen. The role he settled into was, on paper, unglamorous. Hitler needed someone to manage correspondence, to sort the avalanche of letters and petitions that arrived as the movement grew, to filter the useful from the deranged, to keep the machinery of the Führer's personal office running with quiet efficiency. Hess became that person. He arrived early, stayed late, handled details that Hitler found beneath his attention, and never once complained about the arrangement. Where other men in Hitler's circle jostled for prominence, craved the spotlight, needed to be seen and heard to feel their own importance, Hess seemed genuinely content to disappear behind the man he served. It was a quality Hitler noticed and valued deeply. In a circle of performers, Hess was the stagehand who kept the lights on. What made the relationship unusual was its texture. Hitler was a man of extraordinary social volatility, theatrical in his rages, generous in his enthusiasms, capable of warmth one moment and cold dismissal the next. Most people who worked closely with him navigated that volatility with careful anxiety. Hess navigated it differently. He seemed to genuinely understand Hitler's moods, to anticipate them, to absorb them without resentment. There was something almost fraternal in the dynamic during these years, though the hierarchy was never in question. Hitler was the visionary. Hess was the faithful companion who made the vision possible in the ordinary grind of daily life. Contemporaries noted that Hess was one of the very few people permitted to simply be present with Hitler in silence, without needing to perform or entertain. That intimacy was currency, in a court built on competition. Throughout the late 1920s, as the Nazi Party rebuilt itself after the humiliation of the failed putsch, Hess's organizational role quietly expanded. He was not a theorist. He was not an orator of Hitler's caliber, nor a bureaucratic genius of the kind that Martin Bormann would later embody. But he was scrupulously reliable, and reliability in a movement still struggling for legitimacy was more valuable than brilliance. He coordinated schedules, managed regional party leaders, and served as a human buffer between Hitler and the constant noise of internal disputes. When men in the party disagreed, and in those years they disagreed constantly, about tactics, about priorities, about territory and resources, it was often Hess who was asked to mediate. He did so without making enemies, which was, in itself, a remarkable skill in that particular environment. The transition into the 1930s changed everything about the scale of what Hess was managing. Germany's economy had buckled under the weight of the global depression. Unemployment had exploded to catastrophic levels, and the Nazi Party's electoral fortunes had risen with brutal speed on the back of national desperation. Millions of new members flooded into the movement. Regional branches proliferated. The party machinery creaked under its own growth. Hess, still serving essentially as the engine room of Hitler's personal office, found himself coordinating across a structure of genuinely staggering complexity. The intimacy of the early Munich days was being replaced by something more institutional, and Hess had to evolve with it. By the early 1930s, his title and formal status were beginning to catch up with the actual weight of his role. He was not yet Deputy Führer, that designation would come after the seizure of power, but within the party's internal hierarchy, he was already understood to occupy a unique position, not because he commanded armies or controlled finances or ran a feared apparatus of repression, but because he controlled access. Access to Hitler was the most precious commodity in the Nazi world, and Hess, quietly and without drama, had positioned himself as its primary gatekeeper. Men who needed to reach the Führer needed Hess first. That was power, even if it was power exercised in the shroud of another man's name. His loyalty was not merely professional, it was emotional, almost worshipful, in a way that went beyond ordinary political allegiance. Hess genuinely believed in Hitler's historical mission, genuinely believed that the man he served was a figure of world historical significance, destined to redeem Germany from the catastrophe of defeat and humiliation. He had written and spoken about this belief in terms that left no room for irony or distance. This was not the calculated loyalty of a man managing his career. It was the conviction of a true believer, and true believers, when they find their object of faith, become capable of extraordinary endurance and extraordinary blindness in roughly equal measure. Hess was capable of both. There was also something in Hess's background that predisposed him to this kind of devotion. He had grown up in a world shaped by authority and structure, his father's firm hand, the discipline of a merchant family, the rigid hierarchies of the military. He was not a man who flourished in conditions of ambiguity. He needed order. He needed to know his place and to occupy it completely. Hitler's movement, for all its chaos at the margins, offered Hess precisely that clarity. He was the deputy, the servant of the vision, the keeper of the flame. In that role, he was total. Outside it, in the early years of his service, he was barely visible. His intellectual life during this period was not idle. Hess read widely in the nationalist and geopolitical literature of his era, particularly the work of Karl Haushofer, the geopolitician who would later shape Hess's thinking about Germany's relationship with Britain and the Soviet Union. Haushofer's concept of Lebensraum, living space, had already been absorbed into Nazi ideology by the time Hess was working closely with Hitler during the Landsberg prison period, and Hess served as a conduit between Haushofer's academic world and Hitler's political one. The precise degree to which Hess shaped the articulation of these ideas in Hitler's own writing remains debated by historians, but his proximity to that process was unquestionable. He was present in the room where the ideology was being forged into language. The cultivation of Hess's public profile during these years was modest compared to what would follow. He was not yet the figure who took the podium at mass rallies with the electric formality that would become his signature in the mid-1930s. But he was accumulating experience, learning the rhythms of the movement's performance, understanding how the Nazi Party's public face was constructed and maintained. He attended events. He represented Hitler at meetings where Hitler himself was absent. He began to acquire the bearing of a man who expected to be taken seriously. The awkward former student of the early Munich years was giving way to something more composed, more deliberate, a man who had found his purpose and was growing into it with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they will not be asked to leave. By the time the Nazi Party stood on the threshold of genuine national power in the early 1930s, Hess had spent more than half a decade in Hitler's immediate orbit. He knew the man's habits, his fears, his vanities, his methods of thinking through problems aloud in long monologues, that required nothing from the listener but patience and attention. He had been shaped by that proximity in ways that went deeper than politics. His identity had become inseparable from his role. To be Rudolf Hess was to be the man at Hitler's side. It was a definition that offered everything in terms of belonging and meaning, and demanded nothing less than the surrender of any independent self. He had made that surrender gladly, completely, without hesitation. What lay ahead would prove, over the decades still to come, exactly what that surrender was worth. Power, when it finally arrives, rarely looks the way its seekers imagined. For Rudolf Hess, the morning of January 30th, 1933, did not bring the thunderous vindication he might have once dreamed of in the cramped quarters of Landsberg prison, scribbling notes as Hitler dictated. It brought something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling: responsibility. The National Socialist movement had clawed its way out of the margins and into the machinery of government. And now the men who had spent years cultivating loyalty to a cause were required to prove they could actually govern one. Hess understood instinctively that governing was not the same as believing. Governing required structure, hierarchy, and the careful management of men whose ambitions had been inflamed by years of promise. He was, by temperament and training, precisely the kind of man a new and volatile regime needed most. Not a general, not a strategist, a keeper of order. His formal elevation to Deputy Führer came in the months following the seizure of power, and with it, the full weight of an almost impossible task. Hitler had built his movement on charisma and fury, on the force of a single personality so overwhelming that it had compressed an entire political movement into something resembling a cult of devotion. But cults do not administer tax codes. They do not resolve jurisdictional disputes between competing party offices. They do not discipline the rank and file when local functionaries overreach, humiliate civilians in public, or act in ways that invite embarrassment. Hess was handed that machinery, the unglamorous, essential machinery of party administration, and charged with making it run. He approached the role not as a burden but as a calling, which said a great deal about who he had become. His identity, by this point, was so completely fused with Hitler's project that serving it felt indistinguishable from serving himself. The Nazi Party in 1933 was not a coherent bureaucratic structure so much as a collection of overlapping fiefdoms, each controlled by men of fierce ego and limited patience. The Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted street fighters who had brawled their way through the Weimar years, believed the revolution should continue, that the old elites should be swept away entirely and replaced with men of their own stripe. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, was quietly building something far colder and more methodical. The economic ministries were contested between ideologues and technocrats. Regional party bosses, the Gauleiter, operated with a degree of independence that frequently brought them into conflict with the central party apparatus. Into this fractious environment, Hess moved with a deliberate, almost studied calm. He mediated. He arbitrated. He passed judgment on disputes that would have destroyed lesser men's relationships and ended political careers, and he did so while making clear that every decision ultimately reflected the Führer's will. That phrase, the Führer's will, became something close to a legal instrument in Hess's hands. One of his most consequential contributions to the early Nazi state was the formalization of how Hitler's authority translated into administrative reality. Where genuine written directives from Hitler were rare or ambiguous, Hess and his office developed mechanisms to interpret and implement what they understood Hitler to want. This was simultaneously practical and dangerous. Practical, because Hitler genuinely had little interest in the administrative details of governance and preferred to operate through broad pronouncements and personal loyalties rather than formal procedure. Dangerous, because it created a system in which subordinates competed to anticipate the leader's desires, each faction claiming its own actions represented the true expression of his vision. Hess tried to position himself as the authoritative interpreter, the man whose proximity to Hitler gave him a more accurate reading of what the Führer actually intended. For a time, that positioning worked. His relationship with Hitler during these years remained something exceptional within the regime's inner life. Other men around Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, the rising figures of the SS, maintained relationships with the dictator that were fundamentally transactional. They needed him for power. He needed them for specific competencies. The exchange was understood by both parties, even when dressed in the language of devotion. Hess was different. His attachment to Hitler had the quality of something forged before power arrived, before there was anything concrete to gain, and that history gave him a kind of emotional credit with the man at the center of everything. He was permitted to speak to Hitler in ways others were not. He was permitted into silences that others could not access. Whether Hitler reciprocated this devotion with genuine warmth, or merely exploited it with the instinctive skill of a man who had always known how to use admiration as a resource, remained one of the more opaque questions of the period. What was clear was that Hess believed in the relationship absolutely, and that belief shaped every decision he made. Party discipline in this context was not simply a matter of enforcing rules. It was a matter of protecting the image of the movement and, by extension, the image of Hitler himself. Hess took this seriously to the point of severity. When party members behaved in ways that risked public scandal, corruption cases, personal misconduct, displays of brutality that went beyond what the regime wished to publicly acknowledge, it frequently fell to Hess's office to manage the fallout. He did so with a combination of legalism and pragmatism, understanding that the regime needed to project a certain kind of order to consolidate its hold on a German population that had, after all, not voted for chaos, but for the promise of restored dignity and economic stability. He believed that discipline within the party was the foundation upon which everything else would rest. A party that ate itself would never be able to build the state its ideology demanded. It was during these consolidation years that Hess also became instrumental in the legal architecture of persecution. His office played a direct role in the drafting and implementation of legislation that stripped Jewish citizens of their rights, formalized racial categories, and began the long bureaucratic process of exclusion that would deepen into catastrophe in the years ahead. Hess did not approach this with the visceral hatred of some within the movement. His anti-Semitism was ideological rather than personal, which made it no less lethal and arguably more efficient, the anti-Semitism of administration rather than of the mob. He signed documents. He attended meetings. He lent the authority of his office to processes whose ultimate destination he may not have fully imagined, or perhaps chose not to examine too closely. History would not grant him the mercy of that distinction. The rallies of the mid-1930s, which would come to define the visual memory of Nazi Germany for subsequent generations, were not simply propaganda spectacles. They were, among other things, assertions of hierarchy, carefully choreographed demonstrations of who stood where in the order of things. Hess appeared at these events not as a performer in the way that Goebbels or Hitler performed, but as a presence, a signal of continuity and structure. When he introduced Hitler at Nuremberg, his voice carrying across hundreds of thousands of assembled bodies under the night sky, he was not simply warming up a crowd. He was enacting a ritual of subordination and elevation that encoded, for all who witnessed it, the relationship between the movement and its leader. He was the bridge, the voice that prepared the way. He understood that role, and he inhabited it completely. Within the regime's internal politics, however, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface that no amount of careful mediation could fully seal. The men who had been dismissed or sidelined in the years of struggle were not always gracious in defeat. The men who had risen alongside Hess were not content with their positions and constantly probed for advantage. Goering, in particular, represented a gravitational force that pulled prestige and resources toward himself, with an appetite that was almost geological in its consistency. Himmler built quietly, methodically, constructing institutions of surveillance and control that would eventually outgrow their nominal subordination to party structures entirely. Hess watched these developments with a wariness he was not always able to translate into effective countermeasure. His skills were relational and administrative. The colder, more predatory intelligence of men like Himmler operated in registers he found genuinely difficult to navigate. He compensated, as he always had, through closeness to Hitler. If his bureaucratic position could be eroded by rivals, his personal access to the Führer remained, for now, his most durable asset. He used it carefully, choosing his interventions, reserving his credit. He brought Hitler problems he could solve and solutions that reflected well on the loyalty and competence of his office. He managed his access the way a careful investor manages a finite resource, understanding that its value depended on its not being squandered. And yet he was also genuinely motivated by belief, not performance, not calculation alone, but the deep and somewhat tragic conviction that what he was doing mattered, that the history being made in these years was the history his country had been waiting for, and that he was at its center because he deserved to be. By the mid-1930s, the architecture of the Nazi state was set in its essential form. The consolidation had worked. The rivals outside the movement had been neutralized. The rivals inside the movement had been either co-opted or destroyed. And Rudolf Hess stood, or appeared to stand, at Hitler's right hand, the deputy, the loyalist, the keeper of the flame. He had spent years building something, not just a position within a hierarchy, but a version of himself that existed entirely in relation to one man and one idea. That construction was impressive in its completeness and terrifying in its fragility. Everything it rested on was borrowed. The loyalty, the proximity, the authority, all of it flowed from a single source. And that source, as events would reveal, was not a man who repaid loyalty in kind. He was a man who used it, as he used everything, for as long as it served him. Hess had built himself into an indispensable figure in a regime that was, by design, indispensable to no one but its leader. The years ahead would prove exactly what that meant. By 1935, the man who had once carried Hitler's briefcase and typed his letters had become something else entirely. Rudolf Hess had crossed a threshold that few expected him to reach. He was no longer the quiet aide moving through corridors, whispering into the right ears, smoothing over the right disagreements. He was now a voice, loud, practiced, and broadcast across the German nation through radio receivers sitting on kitchen tables from Hamburg to Munich. The transition had not happened overnight, but once it began, it accelerated with a momentum that surprised even those who had watched him closely. The backroom operator had stepped into the light, and the light suited him more than anyone had anticipated. Germany was listening, and Hess intended to make certain it heard exactly what he wanted it to hear. The context for this transformation was not accidental. Germany in the mid-1930s was a country in the grip of a controlled reinvention. Hitler had consolidated power, The Weimar Republic was a memory already being buried, and the machinery of rearmament was grinding into motion with breathtaking speed. The Versailles restrictions, the limits on army size, the prohibition on an air force, the humiliating constraints on German sovereignty were being dismantled one by one, each removal greeted with orchestrated public jubilation. Hess understood that rearmament was not merely a military project, it was a psychological one. Every new division announced, every Luftwaffe aircraft rolled out of a factory, every naval vessel launched was a statement directed not only at Germany's neighbours, but at the German people themselves. They were being told, systematically and relentlessly, that they were rising again. Hess was one of the men charged with making that message sing. His speeches during this period were carefully constructed instruments. They did not ramble. They did not speculate. They hit their marks with the precision of a man who had absorbed years of Hitler's own rhetorical technique and filtered it through a temperament that was, by nature, slightly cooler, slightly more methodical. Where Hitler's oratory could build to incendiary peaks of improvised fury, Hess brought a different register, a resolute, almost ministerial tone that carried its own authority. Crowds at the great party rallies in Nuremberg responded to him not with the ecstatic frenzy that Hitler generated, but with something closer to reverent conviction. He was the party's conscience made audible. He was the man who explained why everything that was happening was not only necessary, but righteous. That was a role that required a particular kind of belief, and Hess had it in abundance. The Nuremberg rallies themselves deserve attention, because they were the stage on which Hess most visibly performed his enlarged role. These were not mere political gatherings. They were spectacles engineered to overwhelm the senses. Hundreds of thousands of people arranged in geometric formations, floodlights cutting columns of white into a night sky, music timed to induce collective transport. Hess appeared before these assembled crowds as a figure of formal authority, his bearing erect, his delivery measured against the surrounding drama. He opened at least one of the great Nuremberg rallies with the declaration that the party was Hitler and Hitler was Germany, a formulation that collapsed the distinction between a person, an institution, and a nation into a single act of ideological fusion. The words were simple, their implication was total, and Hess delivered them as though they were simply true, as obvious as the laws of physics, requiring no argument beyond the force of his own certainty. Beyond the rallies, Hess extended his reach into international representation in ways that reflected his growing formal status. As Deputy Führer, he was now received abroad as a figure of genuine governmental weight, not merely a party functionary. He met with foreign dignitaries, attended international events, and worked to present a face of Nazi Germany that was, at least superficially, coherent and statesmanlike. This was a role that required considerable performance, because the reality of what the regime was doing, the persecution of Jewish citizens, the systematic dismantling of civil liberties, the accelerating violence of the SS, had to be managed, minimized, or simply denied in public exchanges with international counterparts. Hess proved adept at this management. He had spent years cultivating the art of saying exactly as much as was required and no more. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 placed Hess at the intersection of ideology and legislation in a way that would later define the legal case built against him. These laws, which stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship and criminalized relationships between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, bore the formal imprimatur of the Nazi state's highest structures in which Hess operated with direct authority. He was present at the announcements, involved in the apparatus that gave these measures the appearance of legal order. and publicly supportive of their ideological basis. The laws were presented to the German public not as persecution, but as the formalization of a natural social order, a framing that required exactly the kind of calm, authoritative voice that Hess had been honing. He provided that voice without visible hesitation. His public persona during these years was also shaped by something more personal, a cultivated image of the devoted disciple. Nazi propaganda understood the power of loyalty as a value unto itself, and Hess was its living embodiment. He spoke about Hitler not as a politician or even a leader in any conventional sense, but as a historical force, a figure whose correctness was self-evident and whose authority demanded total submission of individual will. This was not entirely performance. Those who observed Hess closely during this period consistently noted that his devotion appeared genuine, not strategic. He was not a cynic wearing the mask of a believer. He was, as far as anyone could determine, exactly what he seemed, a man who had surrendered his own judgment entirely to another human being and called the surrender a form of grace. The mid-1930s also saw Hess navigate the increasingly complex terrain of the Nazi hierarchy, where ambition moved like a current beneath the surface of official unity. Men like Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring were not passive figures content with their assigned roles. Each was extending his own reach, building his own apparatus, cultivating his own access to Hitler's attention and favor. Hess watched these maneuvers with the wariness of a man who understood that proximity to Hitler was the only currency that truly mattered. His strategy was not to compete on the same terrain as Himmler's police empire or Goebbels's propaganda ministry, but to remain indispensable through a different kind of relationship, the personal one, the one built on years of shared confinement in Landsberg prison, years of correspondence and conversation, and absolute trust. His office, the office of the Deputy Führer, was during this period a significant bureaucratic force in its own right. It had authority to review legislation before it became law, to arbitrate disputes between competing party factions, and to ensure that the ideological line was maintained across the vastly complicated structure of a modern state that was rapidly reorganizing itself around a single party's will. Hess's chief of staff, Martin Bormann, ran much of this machinery with a cold efficiency that Hess himself sometimes lacked, and this arrangement, which Hess endorsed and even encouraged, would later prove to be one of the more consequential errors of his career. He was giving Bormann tools and access that Bormann would one day use against him. But in the mid-1930s, with Germany apparently ascending and the Nazi project apparently succeeding, the future costs of this arrangement were invisible against the present rewards. On the international stage, Hess continued to refine his role as Germany's unofficial ambassador of ideology. He gave interviews to foreign journalists, received foreign officials, and used these occasions to argue that National Socialism was not a threat to European order, but a bulwark against the real danger, Soviet communism. This was a message carefully tailored for audiences in Britain and France, where fear of Bolshevism ran deep in conservative and establishment circles. Hess was not naive about this audience. He understood that ideological revulsion at communism could be leveraged into tolerance for fascism, and he worked that space with considerable skill. He was speaking, in many of these exchanges, directly to the anxieties of men who would rather have peace with a resurgent Germany than face the implications of opposing it. By the time the decade was halfway through its second half, Hess had achieved something genuinely remarkable in the context of how he had begun. He had arrived in Hitler's orbit as an aide, an organizer, a man defined entirely by his relationship to someone else's genius. He had become, through years of patient accumulation, a figure of genuine and independent public weight. He was the man who opened the rallies. He was the man who read the laws. He was the face that foreign governments associated with formal Nazi authority. His name was known across Europe. His speeches were transcribed and distributed and quoted. Whether that recognition rested on any real power, any real independent capacity for decision, that was a question the decade had not yet forced him to answer. It would come, but for now, the platform was wide, the audience was enormous, and the voice that had once carried Hitler's message in whispers was carrying it now in front of hundreds of thousands, across international wires, into the homes and the imagination of a continent that was only beginning to understand what it was truly facing. There are men who find themselves in power, and there are men who find themselves in the air. For Rudolf Hess, these two discoveries arrived in the same decade, and they would come to define him in ways that no party title ever quite could. Long before the late 1930s transformed Germany into a nation of marching columns and burning ambition, Hess had already discovered something that no political appointment could replicate: the sensation of lifting away from the earth and entering a domain where rank meant nothing and skill meant everything. It was a private revelation in a life otherwise defined by public performance, and it would shape him and ultimately destroy him more profoundly than any decision made behind closed doors in the Reich Chancellery. His love of aviation was not a sudden conversion. It stretched back to his youth, to the years immediately following the First World War, when Germany's ruined economy produced, paradoxically, a generation of extraordinarily gifted young pilots with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Hess had trained as a pilot during the tail end of that war, absorbing the culture of the early aviators, their fatalism, their camaraderie, their almost mystical relationship with speed and altitude. He carried that sensibility with him through the turbulent years of Weimar politics, through the failed putsch and the prison sentences, and the slow, methodical rise of the movement he served. Flying was not a hobby he picked up during peaceful times. It was a discipline born in upheaval, kept alive through discipline, and refined through decades of quiet commitment, while the world around him transformed at a terrifying pace. By the time the Nazi Party had consolidated its grip on German life, and the military began its rapid, barely concealed expansion, Hess occupied a position of extraordinary formal power. Deputy Führer was a title of immense symbolic weight, but symbols, as any insider understood, were not the same as leverage. The men who commanded real influence in the Reich were the ones who controlled armies, factories, or the trust of Hitler's most intimate circle. Hess had Hitler's trust, or had possessed it in large measure, but trust, in that regime, was a currency that depreciated quickly unless constantly replenished. Aviation offered Hess something that the party hierarchy could not: a domain where his competence was undeniable, where his standing among serious men was earned rather than conferred. And in Nazi Germany, where the Luftwaffe was rapidly becoming both a military instrument and a propaganda achievement, that domain was anything but peripheral. Hermann Göring commanded the Luftwaffe, and the relationship between Göring and Hess was never warm. These were two men who circled one another with the careful wariness of creatures who understand that they occupy overlapping territory. Göring was theatrical, corpulent, grandiose, a man who had genuinely distinguished himself as a combat pilot in the First World War, and never allowed anyone to forget it. Hess was quieter, more cerebral, more austere. Yet within aviation circles, Hess commanded genuine respect that was separate from, and in certain ways deeper than, the deference Göring extracted through bluster and rank. Hess flew because he loved it. Göring presided over flying. The men who actually flew, the engineers, the test pilots, the designers pushing against the boundaries of what propellers and metal frames could endure, they recognized the difference. And that recognition gave Hess access to corners of Germany's expanding air power that his political title alone would never have unlocked. Throughout the mid to late 1930s, Germany's aviation industry was experiencing a creative explosion that mirrored and magnified the country's dangerous political momentum. New aircraft were rolling out of factories at a pace that astonished the world's military observers. The Messerschmitt designs in particular, sleek, powerful, built for speed rather than comfort, were capturing the imagination of every serious aviator on the continent. Hess did not merely attend demonstrations and sign off on reports from a comfortable distance. He flew these aircraft himself, climbing into cockpits that most senior political figures would have regarded with nervous caution, familiarizing himself with the controls, the limitations, the remarkable capabilities of machines that were reshaping the meaning of warfare. This hands-on engagement was not incidental to his political identity. It was central to it. In a regime that fetishized action and physical courage, a deputy Führer who could genuinely fly, who could hold his own in technical conversation with engineers and senior Luftwaffe officers, carried a different kind of authority than one who merely approved budgets. His participation in air racing and competitive flying during these years further burnished his reputation. There were prestige events on the European calendar that attracted the finest civilian and military pilots, contests that tested navigation, endurance, and precision against some of the most challenging terrain the continent offered. Hess entered these competitions not as a figurehead participant accepting applause from the stands, but as a genuine competitor, absorbing the pressure and the risk that came with serious aerial competition. He did not always win, but he competed with enough seriousness that the aviation community took him seriously in return, and that community included men whose expertise would soon be applied to the greatest air campaigns in history. The credibility he earned in these arenas was real, and in a world where performance was the only currency that mattered, it purchased him relationships and access that raw political power could never guarantee. There was also something psychologically revealing about Hess in the cockpit that the ground could never quite expose. He was, by temperament, a man prone to anxiety, to hypochondria, to the kind of brooding introspection that made him seem remote and strange to many who encountered him in party settings. He experimented obsessively with alternative medicine, with dietary regimens, with anything that might address the unnamed dread that seemed to quietly inhabit him. But in the air, all of that fell away. The cockpit demanded a specific, complete attention that left no room for rumination. It was one of the few environments where Hess appeared genuinely free, not performing loyalty, not mediating disputes, not managing the impossible geometry of Hitler's court. The sky offered him something the Reich could not: clarity. And perhaps it was that clarity, that sense of absolute personal agency above the clouds, that made aviation feel not just like a passion, but like a necessity. His connections with the Luftwaffe's senior technical leadership deepened as the decade wore on, and Germany's preparations for war accelerated from concealment to open defiance of international constraints. Hess cultivated relationships with engineers and commanders who were mapping the future of aerial warfare, men whose names would appear in the operational reports of the campaigns to come. These were not social connections maintained over dinners and party functions. They were working relationships built on mutual respect for the technical craft. Hess understood, as few men in the political hierarchy did, the difference between what aircraft could do on paper and what they could sustain in reality. He understood fuel range, He understood cockpit ergonomics. He understood, with a precision born of personal experience rather than briefing documents, what it meant to navigate over unfamiliar terrain at night. That understanding would later become central to the most audacious decision of his life. There was a particular irony embedded in Hess's aviation passion that would only become apparent in retrospect. The very skills and connections he developed in those pre-war years, the long-range navigation, the familiarity with the Messerschmitt's cockpit, the detailed knowledge of flight routes across Northern Europe, were not the skills of a loyal party bureaucrat maintaining his fitness through a respected hobby. They were the skills of a man unconsciously preparing for something. Not consciously, not with any deliberate plan that could be traced through correspondence or conversation, but there is a kind of preparation that happens below the level of intention, where repeated practice accumulates into capability, and where capability eventually looks for an outlet equal to its ambitions. Hess was building something in those cockpits, one flight at a time, without quite knowing what it was for. As the 1930s moved toward their violent conclusion, and the machinery of European conflict began its inexorable cranking into motion, Hess watched the Luftwaffe he had orbited so closely become the leading edge of a new kind of warfare. He had seen the aircraft evolve from the relatively simple machines of his early training days to the sophisticated, high-speed instruments of destruction that would terrorize Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London. He understood their power. He also understood, with a clarity that his political position both enabled and frustrated, that air power alone could not win the war Germany was sliding toward, that the conflicts accumulating on Europe's horizon would demand something more than speed and altitude to resolve. This knowledge sat uncomfortably alongside his loyalty to Hitler, creating a tension that would eventually require release. In the corridors of the Reich, Hess's aviation reputation afforded him a respect that his increasingly ceremonial party role was beginning to erode. The men who mattered in the late 1930s, the generals, the armaments chiefs, the SS commanders ascending around Hitler, did not particularly fear Hess or particularly need him. He was the loyal shadow, the faithful echo, the man whose title exceeded his current utility to the regime's martial ambitions. But in the hangars and on the airfields, a different version of Rudolf Hess existed. Competent, focused, genuinely skilled, earning his standing through demonstrated ability rather than proximity to power. These two versions of the same man were growing harder to reconcile as war approached. The party man was becoming irrelevant. The pilot was becoming restless. What flying had given Hess, ultimately, was a sense of himself that no political appointment could provide or revoke. It had given him a skill that was entirely his own, a domain where the man and the machine were the only variables that mattered. And in that domain, stripped of the rituals and hierarchies and the suffocating weight of Hitler's presence, Hess found something that might, in other circumstances, have made him a genuinely admirable figure: the courage to act alone. That courage, misapplied, misdirected, built upon a foundation of catastrophic political delusion, would carry him northward over the dark water toward Britain in the spring of 1941. But before that night arrived, there were years of circling, years of building toward a moment that only the man in the cockpit could bring himself to believe was possible. By the middle of the 1930s, Rudolf Hess had achieved what many men only dream of: proximity to absolute power. As Hitler's deputy Führer and personal secretary, he occupied a position of extraordinary influence within the Nazi hierarchy. His office was one of the few places in the Reich where the Führer would permit unscheduled interruption. Hess had spent nearly a decade cultivating this access with meticulous devotion, answering summons at all hours, absorbing Hitler's monologues about race and destiny, and managing the bureaucratic apparatus that kept the party functioning. He had transformed himself into something between a confessor and a court functionary, a man who understood Hitler's moods and desires with an almost telepathic precision. By 1937, this loyalty had paid dividends in formal rank and ceremonial prominence. Yet beneath the surface of these accolades, the ground was beginning to shift beneath Hess's feet. The year 1938 arrived, with an almost palpable sense of tension running through Berlin. Hitler's appetite for territorial expansion had grown more brazen, more urgent, as though time itself were pressing against him. In March of that year, German troops marched into Austria in what was officially called the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria into a single Greater German state. To Hitler, this was the first corrective move in his grand design, the restoration of ethnic and geographic coherence to the scattered remnants of Germanic peoples. To the wider world, it was something far more ominous, the first outright territorial conquest of the new regime, executed with military force and the implicit threat of violence. Hess participated in the propaganda machinery surrounding the Anschluss, delivering speeches and endorsements, performing the role of loyal lieutenant. Yet he was not the architect of this expansion. The initiative had come directly from Hitler, executed by the Wehrmacht and the SS. Hess had been informed of the decision, not consulted. This subtle exclusion from the innermost circle of decision-making would become increasingly difficult for him to ignore as the year progressed. If Austria represented Hitler's first major test of the international order's resolve, Czechoslovakia became his second and far more aggressive move. Throughout 1938, Hitler's attention turned toward the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia populated predominantly by ethnic Germans. His demands grew louder, more insistent, backed by implicit and explicit threats of military invasion. The crisis deepened as summer turned to autumn, and for several weeks in September, Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophic war. Hess watched as Hitler received delegations of foreign powers, as German military preparations accelerated, as the machinery of state propaganda worked at fever pitch to frame German claims as justified and inevitable. He delivered speeches celebrating German nationalism and territorial assertion. He attended the great rallies where Hitler proclaimed his intentions to the assembled party faithful and the watching world. Yet once again, Hess found himself in the position of amplifier rather than architect. The real decisions were being made in smaller circles, by men whose influence over Hitler had grown while his own seemed to stagnate. The Munich Agreement of late September, negotiated between Hitler, Mussolini, and the Western powers, resulted in the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany without military conflict. It was a triumph for Hitler's strategy of calculated aggression backed by military threat. It was not a triumph for Rudolf Hess, who had played no decisive role in securing it. The consolidation of power within the Nazi regime during this period followed a pattern that was both subtle and ruthless. The SS, under the command of Heinrich Himmler, had grown into a state within the state, commanding vast intelligence networks and paramilitary forces that answered directly to Hitler rather than to the formal party apparatus. The Wehrmacht, the German military establishment, had similarly begun to wield influence that bypassed the traditional party hierarchy. Hermann Göring, as commander of the Luftwaffe and head of the 4-year plan for economic rearmament, had positioned himself as an alternative power center to Hess's domain. These men cultivated direct access to Hitler, cultivated his confidence, and cultivated the appearance of being indispensable to his vision of German greatness. Hess, by contrast, occupied an increasingly ceremonial role. He remained Deputy Führer, but the title was growing hollow. His responsibilities had become primarily ritualistic, presiding over party ceremonies, delivering propaganda speeches, and maintaining the fiction of his own importance. The men who were reshaping European geography and preparing Germany for total war were operating in orbits that Hess could no longer influence. The implications of this shift in power dynamics became impossible to ignore as 1939 approached. Hitler had begun to speak more openly about the inevitability of war, about the necessity of acquiring living space for the German people through military conquest, about the elimination of Jewish and Slavic peoples from territories that Germany would dominate. These conversations, which Hess had once been privileged to hear in Hitler's inner sanctum, were now being conducted increasingly with military planners and SS strategists. Hess still received invitations to state dinners and ceremonial occasions. He still held the formal title of Deputy Führer, but the decisions that mattered, the conversations that shaped the regime's future, were happening elsewhere. This realization produced in Hess a combination of psychological responses: resentment at his diminishing importance, anxiety about his place in the regime's future, and a desperate need to find some way to reclaim his relevance and influence. He had devoted nearly 2 decades to Hitler's service. The thought that his role might become merely ceremonial, that his loyalty might be taken for granted without being valued, produced a kind of existential crisis for a man whose entire identity had become inseparable from his proximity to power. The military planning for the seizure of Czechoslovakia and the planning that would ultimately lead to the invasion of Poland in September 1939 revealed the extent to which Hess had been sidelined from genuine decision-making authority. The German High Command, the Foreign Ministry, and the SS intelligence apparatus made the calculations about timing, logistics, and international response. Hess learned of these plans as a subordinate is informed of decisions already made, not as a participant in their formulation. He was expected to support them, to defend them publicly, to help mobilize the party apparatus for their implementation, but he was not expected to shape them. This represented a fundamental inversion of the relationship Hess had cultivated with Hitler throughout the 1930s. He had built his entire position on the foundation of being the one man Hitler trusted implicitly, the one man who could influence his thinking and provide counsel that he valued above that of his military and bureaucratic subordinates. Now that position was being systematically undermined, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, inexorable process of being excluded from the circles where power was actually exercised. The rearmament programs that had accelerated throughout the late 1930s represented both an opportunity and a threat for Hess. As a passionate pilot and enthusiast for aviation, he had positioned himself as a liaison between the Nazi Party and the Luftwaffe, between Hitler's vision and the technical realities of military aviation. Hermann Göring, however, controlled the Luftwaffe directly and reported to Hitler on aviation matters. Hess found himself in the awkward position of being peripherally involved in aviation circles without commanding genuine authority over them. He could fly, and he flew frequently, demonstrating his personal mastery of modern aircraft. He could speak knowledgeably about aviation technology and strategy. Yet the fundamental decisions about aircraft production, about aviation tactics, about the deployment of the Luftwaffe were being made by men who occupied positions of greater formal authority than he did. This pattern repeated itself across every sphere of Nazi activity. Whatever talents Hess possessed, whatever enthusiasm he brought to his assigned duties, he was increasingly operating in the shroud of more influential men. The psychological toll of this gradual diminishment is difficult to overstate. Hess had been accustomed to believing that his presence in Hitler's circle was essential, that his counsel would be sought on matters of profound importance, that his loyalty would be rewarded with ever-increasing power and influence. The realization that the regime was functioning perfectly well without his input, that decisions of historic consequence were being made in his absence, and that his role was becoming largely ornamental, must have produced profound dissonance. He responded by working harder, by redoubling his efforts to demonstrate his value through speeches and public appearances, by attempting to remain the most visible embodiment of Nazi Party loyalty and discipline. In doing so, he was attempting to solve a problem that could not be solved through additional effort or deeper devotion. The regime was transforming itself from a movement controlled by a single dominant figure and his closest associates into a totalitarian state managed by competing power centers that answered to Hitler but did not necessarily answer to one another. In this transformation, a man whose sole source of authority was his personal relationship with Hitler was bound to find his position increasingly precarious. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the moment at which the Nazi regime definitively shifted from a state of preparation to a state of total war. For Hess, this moment represented both a final hope and a terminal acknowledgement of his displacement. Perhaps, he may have reasoned, the onset of actual military conflict would restore him to the center of decision-making. Perhaps Hitler would require the services of his oldest and most loyal comrade as the great struggle for European dominance unfolded. Perhaps his role as deputy Führer would suddenly become essential to the war effort. These hopes proved to be tragically illusory. The onset of war did not restore Hess to power. Instead, it accelerated the process of his marginalization. Military considerations now dominated every aspect of policy and decision-making. The Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the SS intelligence and security apparatus, and the Nazi economic planners became the true power brokers in the regime. The Nazi Party, which had been the vehicle for Hitler's rise to power, became increasingly subordinate to military and security imperatives. Hess, as the highest-ranking party official, found himself presiding over an institution that was being gradually stripped of real authority and influence. What made this process particularly cruel was that Hess was aware of it, that he understood what was happening, and that he was powerless to prevent it. He had no independent power base. He controlled no military forces. He commanded no secret police apparatus. His only source of authority had always been his relationship with Hitler, and that relationship, while formally unchanged, had been fundamentally altered by the transformation of the regime itself. Younger men like Albert Speer, who possessed technical skills deemed essential to the war effort, were being elevated to positions of unprecedented influence. Men like Martin Bormann, who occupied the position of Hitler's personal secretary, were consolidating power over the party apparatus precisely because they were willing to operate in the shadows, to avoid claiming formal authority, and to simply execute Hitler's will without question or independent ambition. Hess had been the model for this kind of absolute loyalty, but now he was being superseded by men who had learned the lessons of his example too well. He had taught the Nazi regime how to function through unwavering devotion to a single leader, and that apparatus now functioned with such efficiency that it had no need for the teacher. The physical act of remaining as deputy Führer, of fulfilling the ceremonial and propagandistic duties of that role, became an exercise in the management of diminishing relevance. Hess continued to deliver speeches at party rallies, speeches that grew increasingly passionate, as if oratorical intensity could somehow compensate for political impotence. He invoked the unity of the Nazi movement and the iron discipline of the party structure. He celebrated the Führer with the kind of fervent devotion that had characterized his relationship with Hitler from the beginning. Yet these performances took on an almost elegiac quality, as though he was speaking not for the future, but from the margins of an institution that was rapidly transforming into something unrecognizable. The party rally at Nuremberg in 1939 would prove to be one of his final public appearances before the catastrophic decision that would define the rest of his life. He stood before the assembled masses and proclaimed the eternal victory of the German people and the inexorability of the Führer's vision. He did not know that, in less than 2 years, he would attempt an audacious gambit to preserve his relevance, a gambit that would instead precipitate his final and total fall from grace. The shadow over Europe during 1938 and 1939 was not merely the shroud of war. For Rudolf Hess, it was also the shroud of his own obsolescence, the creeping realization that the world he had built his identity around was transforming itself in ways that had no place for men of his particular talents. The aggressive expansionism that Hitler pursued across Austria and Czechoslovakia and into Poland represented the fulfillment of policies that Hess had endorsed and propagandized for years. Yet in their execution, those policies rendered him superfluous. The regime had learned to function without him, had developed alternative power structures and decision-making processes that did not require his participation or his counsel. This was the deepest irony of his situation. He had devoted himself to serving Hitler's vision, and that vision had now developed a momentum of its own that no longer required his service. As war consumed Europe, and the regime committed itself fully to the conquest and subjugation of an entire continent, Rudolf Hess faced a future in which he would have to choose between accepting his marginalization or taking some desperate action to restore his relevance before it was too late. The shadows lengthened across Europe, and in those shadows, Hess began to contemplate a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The 1930s had been Rudolf Hess's golden years. As Hitler's closest confidant and most loyal servant, he had risen from obscurity to the second highest rank in the Nazi hierarchy. His office adjoined the Führer's own, his voice carried weight in the corridors of power, and his presence at state functions and party rallies symbolized the regime's internal cohesion. But by the autumn of 1939, as German tanks rumbled across the Polish frontier and the machinery of European war began its inexorable grinding, Hess would discover a terrible truth. Proximity to absolute power provides no protection against irrelevance. The very chaos that Hitler thrived upon, the competing factions, the deliberate ambiguity of authority, the constant maneuvering of rival strongmen, was about to consume him. The man who had styled himself as the architect of Nazi loyalty was about to become a relic, a figurehead with a grand title and no authority. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked a watershed moment in the Nazi regime's trajectory. What had begun as a diplomatic and ideological project, pursued through rearmament and carefully calibrated aggression, had metamorphosed into total war. Hitler's decision to attack Poland was not born from committee, not debated in councils, not refined through the kind of deliberative process that might have given men like Hess a central role. Instead, it emerged from Hitler's own paranoia and certainty, his conviction that Germany's moment of destiny had arrived and that hesitation would be fatal. Hess, for all his closeness to the Führer, had not been privy to the final decision-making. He learned of the invasion like most senior party officials, as something already determined, already set in motion, already beyond the reach of modification or counsel. This was a significant signal, though Hess may not have fully recognized it as such. The Führer was moving beyond the need for his most loyal subordinate. The power structure of Nazi Germany had always resembled a feudal arrangement rather than any rational bureaucratic hierarchy. Hitler sat at the apex, deliberately creating overlapping jurisdictions and competing authorities so that no single subordinate could accumulate enough power to threaten his supremacy. Göring commanded the Luftwaffe and the Four-Year Plan, wielding enormous economic and military authority. Goebbels controlled propaganda and had Hitler's ear on cultural matters. Himmler commanded the SS and was rapidly expanding his grip over the secret state and the apparatus of genocide. And then there were the military professionals, the generals of the Wehrmacht, who had their own chains of command and their own claims on Hitler's attention. Hess's role had always been that of the bridge between the Führer and the party, the conduit for Hitler's will and the enforcer of party discipline. But as war demands intensified, Hitler's attention turned inevitably toward those who controlled the instruments of military and police power. Speeches and ideology, however stirring, could not defeat Britain or subjugate France. Only guns and soldiers could do that. The invasion of Poland revealed immediately the scale of the problem that would confront Hess throughout the war years. The Wehrmacht, under General Franz Halder and the Chief of the General Staff, had operational control over the armies. The Luftwaffe, under Göring, controlled the air war. The SS, under Himmler, operated alongside the Wehrmacht to implement the regime's racial and ideological policies. Hess's ceremonial authority as Deputy Führer existed on paper, but when it came to actual military decisions, resource allocation, or policy implementation, he had no seat at the table. His signature was required on party decrees, and his approval was sought for party matters. But these were increasingly peripheral concerns in a regime consumed with the waging of war. The bureaucracies of the Nazi state had begun their rapid specialization and militarization, and Hess, who had always been a generalist, a figure of personal loyalty rather than technical expertise, found himself with less and less to do. His influence was measured in access and proximity, and both were becoming less valuable when the Führer spent his time in strategy meetings with generals and weapons specialists. Throughout 1939 and into 1940, Hess attempted to maintain his position through sheer visibility and ceremonial importance. He appeared at public functions, delivered speeches at party gatherings, and continued his routine of attending to Hitler's schedule and preferences. But these activities were increasingly empty gestures, performances of authority rather than its exercise. The home front, which had been Hess's domain through the 1930s, was now controlled by the party apparatus under Hitler's direct orders, and even this domain was being militarized and subordinated to the needs of the war economy. Hess's beloved aviation remained an area of personal interest and genuine expertise, and he cultivated relationships with Luftwaffe pilots and designers. But even this passion could not restore his declining influence. Where Göring, as commander of the Luftwaffe, controlled aviation policy and procurement, and Hess's enthusiasm for aircraft could not translate into power over decisions that Göring jealously guarded. The social and psychological reality of Hess's position cannot be overlooked. He had built his entire identity, his sense of self-worth, his understanding of his place in the world, upon his unique relationship with Hitler and his consequent power within the regime. He had sacrificed normal human relationships, family life, and personal interests to perfect his role as the ever-loyal subordinate, the man who anticipated the Führer's needs and served without question. This personal investment in his position made the gradual erosion of his influence all the more psychologically destabilizing. Unlike other Nazi leaders who could retreat into their power bases, Göring to his Luftwaffe, Himmler to his SS, Goebbels to his propaganda apparatus, Hess had no independent base of power. He was entirely dependent upon Hitler's favor and attention. As those began to diminish, he had nothing to fall back upon, nowhere to assert his authority or maintain his sense of importance. The period from late 1939 through 1940 witnessed a series of military victories that further displaced Hess from relevance. The conquest of Poland, swift and overwhelming, demonstrated the military capacity of the Wehrmacht and the validity of Hitler's strategic vision. The subsequent campaigns in France and the Low Countries in the spring of 1940 seemed to confirm that the Führer's judgment was infallible. Military success fed Hitler's sense of destiny and his dismissal of caution or contrary advice. Those who had counseled restraint, who had advocated for negotiation, or who had raised technical objections to the Führer's plans were proven wrong by events. Those who had followed the Führer blindly, who had never questioned his vision, who had simply obeyed, were proven right. Hess had always been in the second category, the unquestioning loyalist. But unquestioning loyalty, however absolute, cannot create influence in a system where power flows to those who control specific instruments of state authority. By mid-1940, as German armies stood triumphant across Europe and Britain appeared to be on the verge of invasion, Hess's ceremonial significance had become almost a burden. His title of Deputy Führer suggested authority that he no longer possessed. His presence at state functions was required, but increasingly perfunctory. Hitler, basking in military glory and convinced of his own genius, had little use for the loyal advisers who had served him well in the struggles of the 1930s. The regime was now a military dictatorship, barely concealed beneath the apparatus of the Nazi Party, and military dictatorships have little need for deputy leaders. They need generals and weapons designers, logisticians and intelligence officers, not men whose primary qualification is loyalty to the leader. The psychological toll of this displacement was visible to those who knew Hess well. He had always been a somewhat rigid man, prone to a kind of emotional earnestness that bordered on the fanatical. But with the beginning of the war, those who encountered him began to note signs of increasing strain. He suffered from various physical complaints and hypochondria, consulting physicians about his health and worrying obsessively about minor ailments. He became more withdrawn, less engaged in casual interaction with colleagues. His speech remained enthusiastic about the Nazi cause and about his loyalty to Hitler, but it increasingly took on the character of a man reassuring himself about things he feared might no longer be true. The war, which was supposed to bring the triumphant fruition of everything Hess had worked toward, was instead isolating him and undermining the foundations of his identity and purpose. What Hess could not have known, but what was nonetheless true, was that his declining influence was not merely a function of war's demands, but part of a deliberate process that Hitler had set in motion. The Führer was gradually pushing aside the old party loyalists who had served him since the days of struggle in the 1920s. These men, like Hess, had known Hitler before he was all-powerful, had seen him make mistakes and revise plans, had understood him as a mortal and fallible being. Hitler was increasingly intolerant of anyone who had seen his humanity or his vulnerability. He preferred younger subordinates who had never known him except as the triumphant Führer, who had no memory of his struggles or doubts. He also preferred men like Himmler and Göring, who were building their own power bases and had their own ambitions, to men like Hess, whose only ambition was to serve Hitler. A man with no ambition except loyalty, Hitler was coming to understand, could be dispensed with without fear of consequences. A man with ambitions of his own, however ruthless and criminal those ambitions might be, had a reason to maintain his effectiveness. The autumn of 1940 found Rudolf Hess at a crossroads that he did not yet fully recognize. The man who had been Hitler's shadow, his closest confidant, his most trusted servant, was gradually becoming a shroud of his former self. His title remained impressive, his position on paper substantial, but both were increasingly divorced from any genuine authority or influence. The regime was hardening into a structure where power flowed from command of violence, military, police, or both, and Hess commanded neither. His expertise was in party administration, and his gift was for loyal service, neither of which mattered greatly to a regime now consuming all of Europe's resources in preparation for something far larger and more terrible than anyone, perhaps even Hitler himself, fully understood. As the war that Hess had initially welcomed began its inexorable expansion, drawing Germany deeper into commitments and conflicts that would eventually devour the regime entirely, he would find himself increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate to recover the influence he had lost, and that desperation would drive him toward a decision that would cost him everything. By 1940, Rudolf Hess had become a man watching his world slip away. The war that Hitler craved had arrived, and it had not brought him the role he expected. As the Wehrmacht rolled across Europe with crushing efficiency, Hess found himself increasingly marginalized from the inner circles of power. The military commanders, the SS chiefs, the industrial magnates, these men now commanded Hitler's attention and shaped the course of the Reich. Hess remained Deputy Führer in title, a ceremonial position stripped of substance. His speeches grew less frequent. His access to Hitler contracted. The confidant of 2 decades discovered himself becoming a relic, a survivor of the party's early struggles now rendered obsolete by the machinery of total war. It was in this moment of irrelevance that Hess conceived an idea so ambitious, so desperate, that it would consume the last vestige of his influence and ultimately destroy what remained of his career. The seed of this obsession had been planted earlier, whispered through diplomatic channels and intelligence networks that Hess had cultivated with meticulous care. There existed, he believed, a faction within Britain that yearned for peace, men of standing and influence who recognized the futility of continuing the war against Germany. These were not the politicians of London, not the rabid Churchill and his war cabinet, but rather voices from the aristocracy, from the military establishment, from men who understood that a continued conflict would bleed both nations white. Hess had heard rumors of contacts, of intermediaries moving between neutral capitals, of peace feelers extended through Swedish diplomats and Irish businessmen. More tantalizing still was the name that appeared repeatedly in these fragmentary reports, the Duke of Hamilton. This Scottish nobleman, a man of flying experience and aristocratic privilege, seemed to Hess the perfect conduit. He believed, or perhaps desperately wanted to believe, that Hamilton represented a genuine peace party, that he possessed both the connections and the will to broker a settlement that could reshape Europe's future. What made this vision possible was Hess's singular advantage, his pilot's license, and his passion for flying. While other Nazi leaders had abandoned their personal connection to the practical machinery of war, Hess had maintained his interest in aviation, cultivating relationships with Luftwaffe commanders and test pilots. He had access to aircraft that few men in the Reich possessed. He understood the technical specifications of German fighters, the fuel capacities, the range calculations that would determine whether a man could fly from German airspace to the Scottish coast and back again. This was not a fantasy born from the mind of a delusional politician, but rather a plan built upon real aeronautical possibility. Hess began to study the routes in secret, consulting with aviation specialists under the pretense of routine inquiries. He obtained detailed maps of the North Sea, calculated wind patterns and fuel consumption, and gradually transformed what had begun as a desperate hope into something more concrete, a viable operation. The irony that would later become apparent to historians and interrogators alike was that Hess's motivations, whatever their psychological roots, derived from a plausible analysis of Nazi strategic interests. He was not proposing a surrender or even a dramatic reversal of Hitler's territorial ambitions. Instead, Hess envisioned a settlement that would allow Germany to consolidate its continental dominion while Britain withdrew from the war and allowed Hitler a free hand in the East. From Hess's perspective, this was rational, even generous. Germany would achieve its domination of Europe. Britain would preserve its empire and its navy, and most crucially, Hitler would be liberated to pursue what had always been his true obsession, the destruction of Bolshevism and the conquest of Soviet territory. Hess believed that once Stalin's Russia was eliminated as a factor, the ideological and strategic logic of the war itself would evaporate. Peace with Britain was not a contradiction of Nazi ideology, but rather a prerequisite for its ultimate triumph. In this calculus, Hess saw himself not as a peacemaker in the conventional sense, but as a strategic visionary capable of achieving what the military and political establishment could not: a negotiated settlement that served German interests while offering Britain an honorable exit from a conflict it could not win. Throughout 1940, as France fell and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine, Hess became increasingly consumed by this vision. He spent hours analyzing intelligence reports about British sentiment, piecing together fragments of information from neutral sources and Nazi diplomatic channels. He cultivated relationships with individuals who might serve as intermediaries or sources of information. He spoke obliquely to trusted associates about the possibility of a separate peace, never revealing the full scope of his intentions, but allowing hints of his ambitions to circulate among those close enough to hear them. His conversations became tinged with an undertone of desperation, masked by theoretical discussion. He would muse about the tragedy of two Aryan nations locked in pointless combat, about the senselessness of destroying the very civilization that should stand united against communism. These remarks were not idle speculation. They were reconnaissance, testing to see who might share his vision, who possessed the connections or the courage to support such an unprecedented initiative. The plan began to crystallize in concrete terms sometime in 1941, though the exact timeline remains somewhat obscured by the fog of history and the reluctance of those involved to commit details to paper. Hess arranged through intermediaries to obtain a Messerschmitt 110, a twin-engine fighter aircraft with sufficient range to reach Scotland and sufficient performance to evade British fighter defences if the pilot possessed sufficient skill and fortune. He gathered maps and intelligence about British airfields, about the locations where he might safely land or bail out. He began correspondence with Swedish intermediaries, individuals with connections to Britain who might serve as conduits for his intentions. More mysteriously, he attempted to establish contact with the Duke of Hamilton through a German attaché in Sweden, hoping to signal his desire for a secret meeting. Hess was attempting to orchestrate a rendezvous without the explicit knowledge or authorization of Hitler, a development that suggests either supreme confidence in his own judgment or a profound delusion about his remaining influence. What propelled Hess from contemplation to action was the growing conviction that time was running out, that the window for peace was rapidly closing. The failure to invade Britain in 1940 had stalled the war's momentum. The Reich controlled nearly all of continental Europe, yet Britain remained unbowed, supplied by American materials and buoyed by Churchill's defiant speeches. Hess understood, even if Hitler refused to acknowledge it, that the war was taking on a character of attrition that Germany could not sustain indefinitely. More pressingly, Hitler's obsession with the Soviet Union had become increasingly apparent to those within the inner circle. The Führer spoke with mounting frequency of the eventual confrontation with Bolshevism, and Hess recognized that this vision would inevitably lead to a colossal continental conflict. If peace with Britain could be achieved before that apocalypse began, Germany's strategic position would be immeasurably strengthened. Hess had become convinced that he alone possessed the perception and the courage to accomplish what other leaders lacked the imagination to attempt. It was this convergence of rational strategic analysis and personal narcissism, of genuine insight and monumental delusion, that drove Hess toward his fateful decision. By the spring of 1941, Hess had moved beyond planning and entered the realm of active preparation. He had obtained a Messerschmitt 110 from the Augsburg aircraft factory, ostensibly for evaluation purposes. He had studied the aircraft's systems with obsessive attention, memorizing fuel calculations and performance characteristics. He had refined his maps and his flight plan, identifying a route that would take him across the North Sea at night, flying low to avoid radar detection, descending toward the Scottish coastline under cover of darkness. He had even obtained the personal details of the Duke of Hamilton, studying photographs and biographical information as though the Scottish nobleman were a target to be acquired rather than a negotiating partner to be met. Hess was preparing to commit what would be, from Hitler's perspective, the ultimate act of hubris and betrayal, a unilateral diplomatic mission conducted without authorization, risking not only his own life, but potentially the security and prestige of the entire Nazi state. Yet in Hess's mind, there was no hubris, only clarity. He was acting in Hitler's interest even if Hitler could not perceive it. He was serving the Reich even as the Reich would initially condemn him. The decision to fly was made sometime in late April or early May of 1941. Though the exact moment of resolution remains obscured. What is certain is that by early May, Hess had completed his preparations to an extent that committed him to action. He had written letters to Hitler, to his wife, to individuals who might understand his motivations or serve as witnesses to his intentions. These documents, which would later be examined by British intelligence and Nazi investigators alike, reveal a man convinced of the rightness of his cause, confident that he would succeed, and prepared to accept whatever consequences might follow if his mission failed. He had calculated the risks, the possibility of being shot down, of being captured, of being disowned by Hitler, and had determined that the potential for achieving a separate peace with Britain outweighed the dangers. He had even prepared a cover story should he survive the flight, but fail to make contact with the Duke of Hamilton. He would claim to have flown to Scotland to meet with the Duke, establish the groundwork for negotiations, and negotiate for the release of German prisoners of war held by the British. This narrative, if accepted, might allow him to return to Germany with some shred of credibility intact. The peculiar mixture of idealism and delusion that characterized Hess's final preparations becomes apparent when one considers the fundamental assumptions upon which his plan rested. He believed that the Duke of Hamilton wielded significant political influence in Britain, that Churchill could be bypassed or overruled, that a separate peace treaty could be negotiated between equals, despite the vast gulf separating the two nations' war aims. He believed that the British upper classes shared his contempt for democracy and his fear of communism, that they would welcome the opportunity to negotiate with Nazi Germany. He believed that he, Rudolf Hess, possessed sufficient credibility and authority to speak for Hitler and the Reich in these negotiations. Most fundamentally, he believed that his personal intervention could alter the course of the Second World War, that his flight to Scotland would be remembered as a turning point in history. These were not modest assumptions. They were the convictions of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades in Hitler's shadow and had come to confuse proximity to power with the possession of power itself. On the evening of the 9th of May 1941, Hess made his final preparations. He wrote farewell letters and arranged for them to be delivered. He checked his aircraft one last time, confirming that every system was functioning, that his fuel reserves were adequate for the crossing. He dressed in a Luftwaffe uniform, conscious that this garment would signal his status should he be captured. He obtained a parachute and reviewed the latest weather reports, studying the meteorological conditions that would determine whether his crossing would be possible. Around midnight, as the darkness of a Scottish night gathered thousands of miles away, Hess walked toward the aircraft and prepared to cast his fate to the winds. Behind him lay 2 decades of loyalty, of service, of a life defined entirely by proximity to Hitler. Ahead of him lay either the redemption he desperately sought or the catastrophe that would consume what remained of his career and freedom. He climbed into the cockpit of the Messerschmitt 110, engaged the engines, and prepared to fly toward a rendezvous with destiny. Hashga, Chapter 10. In the spring of 1941, Rudolf Hess stood at the edge of a decision that would obliterate everything he had constructed. The months of secret planning, the careful cultivation of contacts, the gathering of aviation charts and intelligence reports, all of it had led to this singular moment of commitment. He had convinced himself that what he was about to do would not be betrayal, but rather salvation. He alone possessed the clarity of vision that others lacked. He alone could see that peace with Britain was possible if only the right intermediary could be found, if only someone from Hitler's own circle could speak directly to the men of power in London who yearned for an end to the bloodshed. In his mind, Hess had become not a conspirator, but a peacemaker, a man willing to risk everything for the Führer's true interests, even if the Führer himself did not yet understand the genius of what was being attempted. This was the logic that sustained him as he moved through the final days before his flight, a logic born of desperation, privilege, and the particular blindness that comes from believing oneself indispensable to history. The evening of the 9th of May arrived cool and clear over the German airfield at Augsburg-Hounstetten. Hess had chosen his moment with calculated precision. The weather reports promised favourable conditions across the North Sea and into Scottish airspace. The new moon would provide darkness for his departure and approach. The Messerschmitt 110 fighter aircraft had been modified to carry extra fuel tanks, extending its range far beyond the aircraft's normal operational distance. Hess had been obsessive about every technical detail, working with Luftwaffe engineers who had no idea of the true purpose of the modifications. He told them it was a reconnaissance mission, a long-range photographic survey. They asked no further questions. Authority and rank carried their own silence. On this penultimate evening, Hess attended a dinner at his residence in Munich, playing the role of Deputy Führer with practiced ease. He made casual conversation. He displayed no sign of the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Those around him noticed nothing unusual. He had kept his secret for months, locked away in his private consciousness, shared with almost no one save his astrologer and a handful of carefully vetted intermediaries. This compartmentalization of knowledge was perhaps the only intelligent thing he had done in preparation for the flight. It meant that when he disappeared, when the aircraft vanished into the night, there would be genuine confusion in Berlin about what had happened. The next morning, at approximately 10 o'clock local time on the 10th of May, Hess arrived at the airfield in his personal Mercedes, the vehicle winding through the spring world of Bavaria toward the runway where his Messerschmitt awaited. He was dressed in the grey-blue flight suit of the Luftwaffe, his pilot's insignia visible on his chest. He carried with him a letter addressed to the Duke of Hamilton, a Scottish peer whom Hess believed to be sympathetic to peace negotiations and connected to circles of British opinion that opposed continued warfare. The letter was not merely a greeting card, it was a proposal, a plea, and a diplomatic overture, all contained within careful German prose. Hess believed that the Duke would recognize the significance of a personal emissary arriving directly from Hitler's inner circle, that he would see immediately that serious negotiation was possible. He believed that once this contact was established, once trust could be built, the machinery of peace could be set in motion. The British, Hess reasoned, were exhausted by war. The Americans had not yet entered the conflict. A separate peace in the West would leave Hitler free to address what he saw as the true existential threat to Europe, the Soviet Union. This was the architecture of Hess's hopes, and it was built almost entirely on assumption, rumor, and the particular kind of magical thinking that had become increasingly common among men who had spent years within the sealed world of Hitler's court. As the morning light continued to fade into afternoon, and as ground crews made their final checks of the aircraft, Hess methodically prepared himself for the flight ahead. He tested the canopy mechanisms. He verified the fuel gauges and the operation of the navigation instruments. He studied once more the maps he had memorized during weeks of preparation. The route would take him northwest from Bavaria, across the width of Germany, across the North Sea, and into the airspace above Scotland. He would fly at low altitude to avoid detection by German air defense systems, systems that might otherwise mistake his aircraft for an RAF bomber approaching from the coast. He would cross into British airspace still undetected, still unannounced, and then, once he had reached his designated location near the Duke of Hamilton's estate in Lanarkshire, he would bail out of the aircraft and descend by parachute into the Scottish darkness. What happened after that was where his planning became increasingly vague. He imagined himself being discovered by sympathetic parties. He imagined courteous treatment and swift transport to London. He imagined meeting with British officials who would understand the magnitude of what he had come to propose. He imagined returning to Germany as a hero, having secured a separate peace that would make him, in Hitler's eyes, not a pariah, but a genius. The reality of what was to come existed in sharp contradiction to these imagined scenarios, but Hess did not allow this contradiction to prevent him from action. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, as darkness descended completely over Bavaria, and as the airfield fell quiet around him, Hess climbed into the cockpit of the Messerschmitt 110. The engine rumbled to life. The propellers began their characteristic rotation, blurring into translucence in the darkness. Ground crew members stood at a distance, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. They had no idea this was the final moment of Rudolf Hess's life in Germany. They had no idea that the aircraft taking off into the night was carrying the Deputy Führer away from his nation, away from his position, away from the only world he had known since 1923, when he first entered Hitler's orbit in Munich. The Messerschmitt accelerated down the runway, its wheels leaving the tarmac, its wings catching the air and lifting the aircraft skyward into the cool darkness of the German night. Behind Hess lay Munich, the city where his political journey had begun. Behind him lay Berlin and the Reich Chancellery where Hitler waited. Behind him lay power and position, and the elaborate hierarchy that he had spent nearly 2 decades constructing and perfecting. What lay ahead was uncertainty so profound that it defied calculation. The aircraft climbed steadily into the night sky, the navigation lights dark, the aircraft invisible to ground observers who might have tracked its departure. Hess held the aircraft on course, his hands steady on the controls, his concentration absolute. Hour after hour, the Messerschmitt flew northwestward through the darkness. Below lay the forests and mountains of Germany. Then came the coast, the sudden transition from land to sea, and then the open expanse of the North Sea itself, black and featureless below, the aircraft caught between the dark sky above and the dark water below, suspended in a void that seemed to contain no reality at all. The crossing of the North Sea consumed hours. The fuel gauges slowly declined as the aircraft burned through its reserves at a steady, inexorable rate. Hess monitored his course constantly, aware that even small navigational errors would result in missing Scotland entirely, in running out of fuel over open water. He thought about the Soviet Union, about the threat that Hitler perceived there, about how his actions in the next hours might reshape the map of Europe. He thought about honor and duty, and the distinction between loyalty to the Führer and loyalty to what he believed the Führer truly wanted, even if the Führer himself could not yet see it. The night was long, the darkness was absolute, and then, gradually, the darker line of the Scottish coast began to emerge from the blackness ahead, the landmass becoming visible as the aircraft approached, the geography of Britain beginning to take shape against the night sky. What happened in the final moments of the flight remains somewhat unclear in its precise details, but the broad outline is established by Hess's own later testimony and the accounts of British observers who tracked the aircraft as it entered Scottish airspace. The Messerschmitt had been detected by RAF radar stations. Pursuit aircraft had been scrambled in response. A Spitfire was climbing toward the altitude where Hess's aircraft flew, its pilot guided by ground control toward the unidentified intruder. Hess, unaware of how close pursuit had become, continued on course toward his rendezvous location. The night was dark enough that no contact was made between the intercepting fighter and the Messerschmitt. The Spitfire pilot never managed to establish visual contact with his target, and so Hess continued on, over the Scottish landscape, his fuel reserves now critically low, the moment of bailout rapidly approaching. Somewhere near the town of Eaglesham, in the county of Renfrewshire, with fuel nearly exhausted and with no runway visible in the darkness below, Hess made the decision to abandon his aircraft. The canopy of the Messerschmitt opened to the night air. The slipstream hit Hess with the force of a physical blow, the wind and darkness and cold pressing in around him as he prepared to eject from the cockpit. For a moment, he paused at the threshold between the aircraft and the void. Behind lay everything he knew. Ahead lay everything he had gambled upon. Then he threw himself out of the cockpit into the darkness. The parachute opened above him with a violent jerk. Hess found himself suspended beneath a canopy of white silk, drifting downward through the Scottish night toward a landscape he could not see. The wind carried him across fields and farmland. Below, the outline of the earth was visible in the starlight, textured and real, and no longer the abstract concept it had been while flying at altitude. The ground came up to meet him with surprising speed. Hess landed hard on a hillside or field, his body striking the earth, his parachute collapsing around him as the fabric fluttered in the darkness. For a moment, he lay there in the Scottish grass, his heart racing, his breath coming in urgent gasps. He had crossed the North Sea. He had reached Scotland. He had accomplished what he set out to do. Behind him, descending through the darkness in a long, gradual dive, the Messerschmitt 110 continued its flight unmanned, its engines still running, its fuel burning away. The aircraft descended lower and lower until it struck the ground somewhere near the village of Eaglesham with a violent crash. The impact was tremendous, the aircraft disintegrating on impact, its fuselage crumpling, its engines torn from their mountings, the entire aircraft transformed into twisted metal and scattered debris across the Scottish landscape. The fire that followed illuminated the night sky, visible for miles around. Within minutes, observers from nearby farmsteads and villages were seeing the flames. Within hours, British authorities were being notified of a crashed aircraft in the Scottish countryside. But Hess knew nothing of the aircraft's final moments. He was too occupied with the immediate task of survival and concealment. He struggled out of his parachute harness and attempted to move away from the location where he had landed. The pain in his ankle suggested an injury, possibly a fracture, possibly merely a severe sprain. He could not run. He could barely walk. And so he moved through the darkness, limping, trying to put distance between himself and the scene of his landing, moving blindly through the Scottish night, his uniform making him instantly recognizable to anyone who encountered him, his inability to speak more than halting English, making it impossible for him to explain his presence or his purpose to anyone he might meet. He was alone in a hostile country. He was injured. He was separated from the aircraft that might have provided shelter. He had no weapon. He had no way to make contact with the Duke of Hamilton or any of the intermediaries he had arranged. He had no clear plan for what came next. He had only the faith that if he persisted, if he could somehow make contact with the right people, the machinery of negotiation would begin to turn. That faith would be tested almost immediately. As Hess stumbled through the darkness, attempting to move away from his landing site, a figure emerged from the blackness ahead. A Scottish farmer, awakened by the crash of the aircraft, had come to investigate and had encountered a strange figure in a German flight suit limping through his fields. The farmer demanded to know who he was. Hess, desperate and aware that his great enterprise depended on avoiding immediate capture by ordinary military forces, made a decision that would seal the fate of his peace mission. He told the farmer his name. He told him he was a German officer, and he told him he needed to speak to the Duke of Hamilton, that he carried a message of great importance regarding peace negotiations. The farmer, confused and uncertain what to do with this obviously German stranger, contacted the local Home Guard and the police. Word spread. Within hours, British military forces were converging on the location. Within a day, Hess had been identified, interrogated, and photographed. His great peace mission, which he had imagined unfolding through carefully orchestrated meetings with sympathetic intermediaries, had instead become a matter of public knowledge and official record. In Berlin, when news of the crash and the discovery of Hess's identity reached Hitler, the response was swift and devastating. Hitler was informed that his deputy Führer had been captured by the British. He was informed that Hess had been making unauthorized contact with British intermediaries. He was informed that Hess had flown a stolen aircraft across the North Sea without authorization, in a fury that was partly genuine and partly calculated for propaganda effect. Hitler disowned his deputy. He declared Hess mentally unstable. He announced that Hess had acted without authorization and represented no one but his own deluded imagination. He stripped Hess of his titles and his party positions. He ordered all references to Hess in Nazi publications to be revised or eliminated. He treated Hess, in a word, as a traitor and a madman. For Hess, this response was far more devastating than physical capture by the British. He had not feared imprisonment by the British. He had expected, eventually, to return to Germany as a negotiator and a hero, but he had not prepared himself for rejection by Hitler, for the withdrawal of the Führer's favor, for the severing of the bond that had defined his entire life since 1923. In attempting to save the Third Reich from what he believed was a catastrophic strategic mistake, Hess had instead destroyed himself absolutely. Hast, Chapter 11, The Fall from Grace. The Scottish farmland around Dungerville House lay quiet in the pre-dawn hours of the 11th of May, 1941. Locals had witnessed the crash of a German aircraft the night before, a Messerschmitt 110, its pilot ejected somewhere in the darkness. By morning, a man in a Luftwaffe officer's uniform had been found near the village of Eaglesham, injured but alive, carrying forged identity papers and speaking German with an educated accent. Within hours, word reached military intelligence that this was no ordinary pilot. The prisoner claimed his name was Alfred Horn, but his bearing, his language, his urgent insistence on speaking with the Duke of Hamilton suggested otherwise. By midday, British intelligence had confirmed what seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. The man in custody was Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, the man second only to Adolf Hitler in the regime's hierarchy. He had flown across the North Sea alone, in a single-engine fighter, on what he believed was a peace mission sanctioned by the highest powers in Berlin. He was catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. In Berlin, the news arrived like a thunderbolt. Hitler was informed during a meeting with his inner circle, and his reaction was immediate and volcanic. The Führer's face darkened as the details were relayed to him. Hess had flown to Scotland without permission, without orders, without authorization of any kind. He had acted entirely on his own initiative, driven by private obsessions and delusions. Hitler's response was swift and calculated. He did not pause to question Hess's loyalty or to consider whether there might be some hidden logic to the deputy's desperate gambit. Instead, he moved to protect himself and the regime with surgical precision. Within hours, Hitler issued a formal statement declaring that Hess had become mentally unstable, that he had been acting without the Führer's knowledge or consent, and that he was to be considered a traitor to the Nazi state. The man who had been Hitler's shadow for nearly 2 decades, his most devoted servant, his intimate confidant, was suddenly cast out into the darkness. The fall from grace was complete and absolute. There would be no defense, no explanation, no mercy. Only the cold machinery of a regime turning on one of its own the moment he became politically inconvenient. The propaganda machinery lurched into action with characteristic efficiency. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's master propagandist, understood immediately that Hess's flight to Britain posed an enormous problem. If Hess had been flying with Hitler's knowledge, it suggested that the Führer was considering negotiations with Britain, a sign of weakness that could undermine confidence in Nazi invincibility. If Hess had acted independently, it suggested that the deputy Führer was either insane or treacherous. Either way, a catastrophic embarrassment to the regime's carefully maintained image of absolute control and unwavering unity. Goebbels chose the narrative of mental instability, pushing the story that Hess had suffered a nervous breakdown, that he had become disconnected from reality, that he was no longer of sound mind. This explanation served multiple purposes simultaneously. It protected Hitler by distancing him from Hess's actions. It explained away the embarrassment by attributing it to personal pathology rather than regime failure. And it neutralized Hess as a potential problem, transforming him from a dangerous rival into a tragic figure whose judgment could no longer be trusted. Within days, German newspapers and radio broadcasts were reporting Hess's disappearance with barely concealed contempt, dismissing him as a man whose nerves had finally given way under the strain of high office. The Nazi Party apparatus followed suit with stunning speed. Hess's positions were quietly dissolved. His name began to disappear from official communications. Photographs from party rallies were subtly altered, his image removed or obscured. Officials who had once sought his patronage now publicly distanced themselves from him. The system that Hess had helped to build, the hierarchy he had so carefully constructed, suddenly became an apparatus for his erasure. It was as though the regime had decided collectively that it would be easier to forget Hess had ever existed than to acknowledge the implications of his flight. Those who had served under him, who had climbed the party ladder through his favor, now found it convenient to forget his name entirely. This was the logic of totalitarianism at work. When an individual became a liability, that individual simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The party did not need to imprison or execute Hess, it only needed to declare him non-existent, a man who had never held real authority, whose words and actions carried no weight. By this logic, if Hess had been mad, then nothing he had done while Deputy Führer mattered. Every policy he had supported, every decision he had influenced, every atrocity he had helped to facilitate could now be reframed as the acts of an unstable mind rather than the deliberate choices of Nazi leadership. Yet even as the propaganda campaign unfolded in Germany, questions began to emerge from within the regime itself. Some Nazi officials wondered whether Hess's flight might actually have been authorized, that perhaps Hitler was secretly exploring peace negotiations with Britain through back channels. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and a rising power within the regime, was particularly suspicious. He understood the internal politics of the Third Reich intimately, and he recognized that Hitler's immediate and total repudiation of Hess was almost surely a cover story. But Bormann also understood that questioning Hitler's account was dangerous. To suggest that the Führer was lying about Hess would be to undermine Hitler's absolute authority. So Bormann, like everyone else in the regime, remained silent. He accepted the official narrative while privately harboring doubts. This duality became the unspoken reality of Nazi Germany in the wake of Hess's flight. Everyone knew the official story was not entirely true, but everyone also understood that speaking this truth aloud would be suicidal. The regime had created a situation where the only permissible response was complicit silence. The British, meanwhile, were handling their extraordinary prisoner with remarkable practical sense. Churchill was informed within hours of Hess's capture, and the British leadership faced their own immediate dilemma. Here was Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, claiming to be on a peace mission, insisting that he had come to negotiate with people in Britain who supposedly wanted to end the war. The British had to decide whether Hess was genuinely bringing peace proposals, whether he was a German spy sent to gather intelligence, or whether he was simply a delusional Nazi official whose judgment had finally shattered under the strain. They had to consider whether engaging with Hess in any meaningful way might give propaganda advantage to the Germans, or whether they should simply deny his very existence. Churchill's initial instinct was to use Hess as a source of intelligence about the German regime's internal workings and military capabilities. The Prime Minister authorized a series of interrogations designed to extract as much useful information as possible from the captured German. Hess, for his part, seemed almost relieved to be captured. He had expected to be treated as an emissary, to be received by British officials of high rank, to negotiate the terms of a separate peace. Instead, he found himself increasingly isolated, questioned intensively about everything from the location of German military installations to the details of Hitler's personal relationships and political rivalries. The contrast between Hess's expectations and his actual treatment became increasingly stark as the first weeks of his captivity unfolded. He had imagined himself as a peacemaker, a bridge between two civilizations that need not remain at war. He had pictured himself explaining to British leaders how reasonable negotiations could benefit both Germany and Britain, how they could join forces against the real threat, Soviet communism. Instead, Hess found himself treated as a prisoner of war, albeit one of unusual significance. He was held in military custody, denied access to newspapers, denied communication with the outside world. The British were polite but firm, professional but utterly unsentimental. They had no interest in his theories about what Britain needed or what was possible. They were interested only in what Hess could tell them about Nazi Germany's military capabilities, its leadership structure, and its intentions. Hess gradually became aware that his peace mission had been a catastrophic misjudgment, that he had thrown away his position, his freedom, and his standing within the Nazi regime for what now appeared to have been a foolish fantasy. The British had no intention of using him as a negotiator. They had no diplomatic purpose for him at all. He was simply a source of intelligence, a man to be interrogated and then imprisoned until the war ended. The news of Hess's capture and Hitler's repudiation created a moment of profound confusion within the Nazi regime. Officers and officials struggled to understand how the Deputy Führer could have acted so independently, how he could have done something so consequential without the Führer's knowledge. The official explanation, that Hess was mentally unstable, satisfied no one who was close enough to the regime's inner workings to understand the reality. But the price of expressing skepticism was catastrophic. To question Hitler's account of Hess's mental state was implicitly to accuse Hitler of lying. To suggest that Hess might have been acting with hidden authorization was to undermine the Führer's absolute control. The safer course was silence. The Nazi leadership simply accepted the official narrative and moved on. Hitler appointed a new Deputy Führer and continued with the business of ruling Germany and fighting the war. Hess, in a matter of days, had ceased to exist as a relevant figure in German politics. He had been erased so completely and so efficiently that within weeks, many ordinary Germans barely remembered that the position of Deputy Führer had ever been held by anyone named Rudolf Hess. But the broader implications of Hess's flight and Hitler's response revealed something crucial about the nature of the Nazi regime itself. Here was a man who had been at the absolute summit of power, who had been closer to Hitler than almost anyone else in the world, who had exercised tremendous influence over the regime's internal workings. And yet when he became inconvenient, when he acted in a way that contradicted Hitler's interests, he was simply cast aside without hesitation or mercy. No consideration was given to his years of service, his absolute loyalty, his devotion to the Führer. The regime had no place for sentiment or personal relationships. Everything existed to serve the Führer and the state, and the moment any individual no longer served those purposes effectively, that individual became expendable. This was the reality that terrified the Nazi elite. Every man in Hitler's circle now understood, on a visceral level, that his position was entirely contingent on Hitler's will. One moment of displeasure, one action that the Führer deemed inconvenient, and even the most powerful man in the regime could be eliminated from consideration entirely. Hess's fall demonstrated the absolute fragility of power within the Third Reich, the way it rested entirely on Hitler's personal favor and could be withdrawn at any moment. The propaganda value of Hess's supposed mental instability was enormous, particularly in Germany itself. The regime was asking the German people to follow Hitler into an increasingly vast and destructive war. It needed to maintain an image of absolute competence, unwavering judgment, and invincible leadership. The possibility that the deputy Führer had suffered a mental breakdown was somehow less damaging than the possibility that he might have been acting with hidden authorization. A mentally unstable deputy was an unfortunate individual incident, a personal tragedy that reflected poorly on Hess but not on the regime as a whole. But a deputy Führer who was negotiating with Britain without authorization suggested deeper problems: splits within the leadership, doubts about the war effort, cracks in the facade of Nazi unity. The official narrative of mental instability was therefore not just a convenient fiction, it was a necessary foundation for maintaining the regime's credibility. Goebbels and the propaganda ministry worked tirelessly to ensure that this narrative remained unchallenged within Germany. Newspapers printed it repeatedly, radio broadcasts emphasized it constantly, public figures reiterated it at every opportunity. By the time May of 1941 had ended, most ordinary Germans had accepted the official explanation without question. Yet for Hess himself, imprisoned in British custody and increasingly aware of the true extent of his miscalculation, the knowledge that Hitler had disowned him carried a weight that transcended mere political humiliation. He had devoted his entire adult life to the Führer. He had believed absolutely in Hitler's genius, in the righteousness of the Nazi cause, in the historical significance of the regime he served. And now, having acted out of genuine conviction that he could serve Hitler's interests through a peace mission, he had been cast out and declared mentally unfit. The cruelty of this was not primarily in his imprisonment. He was, after all, being treated reasonably well by his captors. The cruelty lay in the knowledge that the man to whom he had devoted everything, the leader he had served so faithfully, had immediately and completely abandoned him. Hitler had not troubled to defend Hess, had not attempted to negotiate his release, had not even acknowledged the possibility that Hess might have been acting from sincere conviction and loyalty. Instead, Hitler had simply erased him, transformed him into a non-person, a man whose existence was embarrassing and whose memory was inconvenient. For a man whose entire sense of self had been built around his relationship to Hitler, this abandonment was a form of psychological annihilation almost more complete than death itself. The weeks and months that followed Hess's capture saw him gradually understand the full dimensions of what he had done. He had wagered everything on the belief that he could bridge the gap between Germany and Britain, that he could somehow convince British leaders to negotiate peace. Instead, he had achieved nothing except his own destruction. The British had no interest in using him as a negotiator. The Germans had disowned him as a madman. The war continued precisely as it would have continued without his intervention. His sacrifice, his desperate gamble, his audacious flight across the North Sea had changed nothing except his own circumstances. He had traded his position as deputy Führer, his freedom, his standing within the regime, for imprisonment and humiliation. And he had done this at the precise moment when, unbeknownst to anyone in the spring of 1941, Nazi Germany was preparing to launch its greatest military adventure, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In less than a month, Hitler would turn on Stalin, and the entire character of the war would be transformed. The negotiated peace that Hess had imagined would become impossible. By his own actions, Hess had removed himself from history, just as history was about to accelerate beyond anything anyone had previously imagined. The fall from grace was not merely political, it was historical. Hess had become irrelevant at the precise moment when relevance mattered most. The British held Rudolf Hess in a state of deliberate ambiguity. He was not a common prisoner of war, nor was he a criminal awaiting trial. He was something far more valuable and far more strange, a captured Nazi leader who possessed knowledge that no amount of interrogation could fully exhaust. In the days following his capture near Glasgow, as the shock of his arrival rippled through British intelligence circles, a decision was being made at the highest levels of government. Hess was to be kept alive, he was to be questioned, and the strategic implications of what he might reveal could reshape Britain's understanding of Nazi intentions in ways that no battlefield report ever could. The German deputy Führer, once the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, was now locked away in a secure facility, while men in dark suits prepared their notebooks and their questions. Hess himself expected none of this. In those first days of captivity, he harbored a belief that bordered on delusion. Though delusion had become his natural state, he believed he would be treated as a legitimate emissary, that the British would recognize the value of the peace proposals he carried, and that he might be exchanged or released once his purposes were understood. He imagined himself as a negotiator rather than a prisoner, a messenger caught between warring powers, someone whose knowledge and connections would make him too valuable to simply lock away. But the British had other plans. They understood what Hess had begun to realize only slowly, that he was a treasure trove of intelligence, a living archive of Nazi secrets that could only be extracted through careful, methodical questioning conducted in isolation. The man who had once wielded power through proximity to Hitler would now yield information through the patient application of interrogation techniques far more sophisticated than crude violence. The interrogation of Rudolf Hess began with a strange courtesy. Unlike captured soldiers or enemy agents, Hess was treated with a formality that bordered on respect. His interrogators understood the psychology required to extract information from a man of his status and background. Hess was accustomed to deference, to being the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, to commanding attention and obedience. To suddenly strip him of all dignity and authority would produce only obstinacy and silence. Instead, his interrogators offered him a kind of controlled respect, the courtesy due to a dignitary who had fallen from power but retained certain claims to station. They addressed him formally. They allowed him moments of dignity even as they systematically dismantled his political positions and extracted the secrets he carried in his mind. This was interrogation as a form of psychological chess, each move calculated to keep Hess talking, to maintain his belief that cooperation might lead to his eventual release. What emerged from these interrogations was a portrait of the Nazi regime that contradicted many of the assumptions held by Allied intelligence. Hess provided detailed information about German military capabilities, about aircraft production figures, about the state of German naval forces, and about the organizational structure of the Luftwaffe. He described the capabilities of German fighter aircraft and bombers with enough specificity that British military planners could adjust their defensive strategies accordingly. But more than technical military data, Hess revealed the internal dynamics of Hitler's government, the power struggles between different factions, the tension between the SS under Heinrich Himmler and the military establishment under the Wehrmacht. He spoke of Hitler's paranoia, his volatile moods, his absolute intolerance for contradiction or disagreement. Hess painted a picture of a regime held together not by efficient administration but by fear, personal loyalty, and the will of a single man whose grasp on reality was increasingly tenuous. These revelations provided a psychological profile of Hitler and his inner circle that shaped British strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the war. Most significantly, Hess confirmed what British intelligence had begun to suspect, but could not yet prove, that Hitler's ultimate intention was the invasion and subjugation of the Soviet Union. This was not merely a future plan or a distant ambition. According to Hess, invasion was already being prepared, the armies assembled, the logistics calculated. Hess believed, as he stated repeatedly to his interrogators, that such an invasion could be successful, that German military power could crush Soviet resistance within a matter of months. He had come to Britain, he maintained, precisely to prevent this invasion by negotiating a separate peace with the British, freeing Hitler to concentrate his entire military force against the Soviet threat. From Hess's perspective, he had been attempting to serve Hitler's interests by preventing a two-front war. What he did not fully grasp, and what his interrogators quickly understood, was that his peace proposals had no chance of acceptance, that Britain would never negotiate a separate peace that left Nazi Germany in control of continental Europe, and that his mission had been born from a catastrophic misreading of both British politics and Hitler's true intentions. The interrogations also revealed the extent to which Hess had become isolated within the Nazi hierarchy in the months before his flight. Military leaders and SS functionaries had increasingly marginalized him. Hitler's attention had shifted away from the deputy Führer toward the men commanding armies and managing security matters. Hess had become a figurehead, a man with a title and ceremonial responsibilities, but diminishing real influence. This isolation had driven him toward his desperate gambit, toward the belief that he could restore his relevance and his standing by accomplishing something that no one else in the Nazi regime could achieve, a negotiated peace with Britain that would be credited to Hess himself. The interrogators recognized that Hess had been acting not primarily out of genuine political conviction, but out of personal desperation, out of a need to reassert his importance and reclaim his place at Hitler's side. In attempting to do so, he had walked directly into British custody and handed over the secrets of the regime he had sworn to serve. As the interrogations continued over weeks and months, the British faced a strategic decision that would define Hess's remaining decades. They could announce his capture and trial immediately, using him as a propaganda tool to demonstrate that the Nazi regime was fragmenting, that its leaders no longer trusted each other, that the deputy Führer himself had attempted to negotiate a separate peace. Or they could maintain silence, keeping Hess in secret custody, continuing the extraction of intelligence, preventing the Germans from knowing the full extent of what he had revealed. The British chose the latter course. Hess was kept in isolation, his location concealed, his interrogation continued in secret. Even as Hitler publicly declared that Hess had been mentally unstable, that he was acting without authorization, that he represented no official position of the German government, the British continued their careful questioning, drawing from Hess every detail of military planning, every name of German officials, every nuance of Hitler's intentions and capabilities. The irony was bitter and complete. Hess had come to Britain expecting to be treated as a negotiator, as a man whose proposals and connections would make him valuable enough to release. Instead, he found himself trapped in the opposite position. He was too valuable to release. Every answer he provided generated a dozen new questions. Every interrogation session revealed new avenues of inquiry. The British intelligence services understood that as long as Hess remained alive and responsive, they possessed a window into the Nazi regime that could not be closed or reopened once the war ended. He was a living source of intelligence, a man with intimate knowledge of Hitler's innermost thoughts, his plans, his fears. To release him would be to squander an opportunity that might never come again. The British kept him in secure facilities, moved him between locations to prevent his knowledge of his surroundings from providing any sense of stability or control, and maintained the interrogation sessions that would continue, with interruptions and variations, for years. What Hess did not know, and what would have horrified him if he had understood it, was that his captors were already planning for the post-war period. British planners were considering the trials that would follow German defeat, the prosecution of Nazi leaders for war crimes and crimes against peace. Hess, as deputy Führer during the critical years of Nazi consolidation and expansion, would be among the most prominent figures to face such prosecution. His rank, his proximity to Hitler, his role in the regime's propaganda and internal organization meant that he would inevitably find himself in a dock, facing judges and prosecutors. The British held him not merely to extract his intelligence during the war, but to preserve him as a witness and defendant for the reckoning that would come after victory. They kept him alive for his knowledge, but they also kept him alive because they knew they would need him alive for the accounting that would follow. The interrogators who questioned Hess day after day developed a peculiar relationship with their prisoner. They came to understand his psychology, his need for approval, his hunger to be taken seriously, despite his diminished status. They exploited these vulnerabilities with professional efficiency. They allowed him to discuss his ideology, his loyalty to Hitler, his belief in the historical necessity of German expansion, knowing that once he began speaking, his compulsion to explain and justify his actions would overcome his initial resistance. They asked him questions to which they already knew the answers, simply to test whether he would lie, to determine which subjects made him evasive, which topics he would discuss openly. They mapped the contours of his mind as precisely as a cartographer mapping terrain, and as they did so, they accumulated a portrait of Nazi Germany that would prove invaluable not only during the war, but for decades of historical analysis that would follow. By 1942 and 1943, as the war turned decisively against Germany on multiple fronts, Hess's value as an intelligence source had not diminished. If anything, it had increased. Every piece of information he provided, every detail he divulged about German capabilities and intentions, had to be weighed against the changing circumstances of the war. The initial German advances in the Soviet Union had stalled. The invasion Hess had predicted would crush Soviet resistance within months had instead bogged down into a grinding war of attrition that was bleeding German strength. The intelligence Hess had provided about German military capabilities had to be assessed in light of these developments. British planners used his information to calibrate their understanding of German resources, to anticipate German strategies, to prepare British defences and offensives accordingly. Hess remained relevant not because his political value had increased, but because the war itself continued to generate questions that only he could answer, with the intimate knowledge he possessed. The longer Hess remained in captivity, the more he began to understand the full measure of his miscalculation. He had expected that by flying to Scotland and making contact with the Duke of Hamilton, he would set in motion a process that would lead to British negotiations. Instead, his flight had isolated him permanently from the regime he had sworn to serve. Hitler had renounced him, declared him mentally incompetent, severed all connection between himself and his former deputy Führer. Any hope Hess had harbored of returning to Germany, of resuming his position, of being recognized as a man whose sacrifice had served the Nazi cause, all of this had evaporated in the moment Hitler publicly disowned him. He was not being held as a prisoner of war who would be released at war's end. He was not a negotiator whose proposals might be revisited. He was simply a captive, a man whose knowledge was being systematically extracted and whose ultimate fate would be decided not by the British, but by the victorious powers and the courts they would establish to try the leaders of the Nazi regime. In the interrogation rooms where he was questioned, Hess slowly became aware that he had not escaped Germany. He had simply walked into a different kind of prison, one from which there would be no release except through death. The British did not know what to do with Rudolf Hess. Here was a man who had arrived on their soil in the most extraordinary circumstances, a deputy Führer fallen from the sky, and yet his value remained maddeningly unclear. The initial interrogation period had yielded intelligence of genuine interest, details about German aircraft production, insights into Hitler's calculations regarding Soviet invasion, fragments of Nazi internal politics that British analysts could cross-reference against their other sources. But as spring turned to summer in 1941, the interrogators faced a peculiar problem. Hess had already told them most of what he knew, or what he believed they needed to hear. The war in Europe was escalating. Hitler's armies were preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the colossal invasion of the Soviet Union that would begin in June. Britain was fighting for survival in the air and at sea, and somewhere in a prison cell, the man who had once stood at Hitler's right hand was becoming surplus to immediate military necessity. Yet they could not simply release him. That was the calculation that defined his captivity across the decades that followed. To release Rudolf Hess would be to admit that his peace mission held merit, that negotiations with Nazi Germany were conceivable even at this stage of the war. It would undermine British resolve at a moment when resolve was all Britain possessed. Moreover, keeping Hess alive meant preserving the living embodiment of Hitler's desperation, proof that the regime had been willing to send its most trusted aide on a fool's errand to negotiate surrender. The British government understood that imprisonment was not merely punishment, it was an argument, a statement carved in human form, declaring that the Third Reich was so corrupted by its own logic that even its most loyal servants became expendable when they deviated from the script. And so the decision was made. Hess would live, but his life would be confinement. His first secure location was the Tower of London, that ancient fortress on the Thames where centuries of imprisoned nobles and state prisoners had awaited their fates. For Hess, the tower represented not execution but exile, a symbolic gesture that marked him as a prisoner of special significance. He was not housed with common prisoners of war. He was not confined in the camps where thousands of other Germans were sorted and organized by rank and service history. Instead, he occupied a space between categories, neither quite a spy nor quite a soldier, neither condemned criminal nor official guest. The guards who watched him were selected for their discretion and reliability. Every aspect of his care was documented. Every conversation was monitored. Every moment was recorded in the vast bureaucratic apparatus that the British had constructed to manage their captive prize. For a man who had once inhabited Hitler's inner circle, who had flown across nations as the Führer's representative, imprisonment in the tower was a spectacular diminishment. The routines of captivity hardened around him like sediment layering stone. Morning light entered his cell at specific times. Meals arrived at fixed hours. Exercise occurred in restricted areas under close supervision. Hess, who had spent much of his adult life orchestrating the movements of thousands, now found his own movements circumscribed by rules issued by junior officers. He was permitted reading materials, but these were carefully selected. He was permitted writing materials, but his letters were censored and rarely sent. He was permitted the dignity of bathing and grooming, small courtesies that served to distinguish him from ordinary prisoners, but also emphasized his dependency. The British were not cruel. They had no interest in making their captives suffer, but they were systematic in their application of control. Hess lived in a world of constraints so complete that they became invisible, the bars and locks so pervasive that he likely ceased noticing them as separate entities from the air he breathed. During these early months of 1941, while Hess occupied his cell, the war transformed around him. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June, and the Wehrmacht poured into Soviet territory with a force that initially seemed unstoppable. The German armies advanced hundreds of kilometers into Russia, surrounded Soviet forces by the millions, captured vast territories and resources. In the halls of power and the trenches and the aircraft cockpits of Europe, the war was being decided. And Rudolf Hess knew nothing of it except what his captors chose to tell him. He could not know that Hitler would reject any notion of negotiation, that the Führer had branded him a traitor and a madman, that his name was being expunged from Nazi records as though he had never existed. Hess could only wait, and hope that eventually someone would see the logic of his mission, that eventually the British would recognize the value of negotiating peace before the Soviet Union consumed both their armies and their futures. But no such recognition came. Instead, the months accumulated into years. By 1942, Hess had spent nearly a year in British custody. The interrogations had become sporadic, then rare, then ceased almost entirely. What was there left to ask him? He was no longer plugged into Nazi decision-making. He had no access to current military intelligence. He was a historical document, preserved in flesh, a reminder of a moment in 1941 when the Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany had believed that he could negotiate peace through the night sky. The British moved him from the Tower to Mytchett Place, a secure military facility in Surrey, a country estate that had been converted into a prison. The change of location did nothing to alter the fundamental condition of his existence. He was confined, separated, isolated from the war that continued without him. The peculiar cruelty of Hess's imprisonment lay not in its harshness, but in its meaninglessness. He was neither a working prisoner, extracting labor or information, nor a condemned criminal awaiting judgment. He was simply detained, his status undefined, his future unknown. The uncertainty gnawed at him across the years. He did not know whether he would be tried and executed, like war criminals hanged at the war's end. He did not know whether the war would end in a negotiated peace that might secure his release. He did not know whether he would die in a cell, his body disposed of in secrecy, his name erased from history as thoroughly as Hitler had erased it from Nazi records. The not knowing became its own form of punishment, perhaps more effective than any torture could have been. Hess had been a man of action, a pilot and organizer, someone accustomed to agency and purpose. Captivity stripped agency from him and left only the hollow ache of purposes unfulfilled. By 1943 and into 1944, the war reached its turning points. The Germans were driven back from North Africa. The Soviet armies began their grinding advance westward. The Allies launched operations in Sicily and Italy. The air war over Germany intensified, British and American bombers reducing German cities to smoking rubble. The war that Hess had believed Britain could escape through negotiation was becoming instead a total catastrophe that consumed everything in its path. German casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. German cities burned. The Luftwaffe, which Hess had once championed as the instrument of German air superiority, was systematically destroyed by Allied air power, and Rudolf Hess, locked behind multiple layers of British security, was entirely absent from these convulsions. The world was remaking itself, and he was watching from behind glass. Other Nazi leaders were pursuing their own trajectories during these years. Goering was overseeing an air force in terminal decline while maintaining his opulent lifestyle. Himmler was orchestrating an industrialized genocide that Hess had not initiated but had surely enabled through his earlier roles in Nazi consolidation. Goebbels continued manufacturing propaganda, even as his audience lived in basements beneath falling bombs. Bormann accumulate power in Hitler's bunker, as Hitler himself withdrew from the realities of military collapse. None of them were imprisoned, as Hess was imprisoned. They remained in Germany, in positions of authority, even as the authority itself became increasingly hollow. The deputy Führer who had served his master so loyally was the one who ended up alone in a cell while his master's regime crumbled around him. The irony was almost perfect in its proportions. The question of Hess's mental state became a subject of intense discussion and speculation during these years of confinement. Had his peace mission stemmed from genuine desperation or from some fracture in his psyche? The British interrogators had noted his unusual demeanor. He seemed to oscillate between grandiosity and paranoia, between the swagger of a man who had once commanded deference and the anxiety of a man who had lost everything. Did he suffer from depression, from the psychological dissolution that comes from years of imprisonment, from the cognitive dissonance of being a Nazi ideologue confronted with the reality of Nazi collapse? The question was never definitively answered, partly because the British authorities had vested interests in maintaining certain interpretations of his mental condition, partly because Hess himself may not have fully understood the machinery of his own mind. What seemed clear was that the man who emerged from his cell in these middle years of captivity was not the same man who had parachuted into Scotland in 1941. The physical reality of long-term imprisonment marked his body. The vigorous pilot and athlete who had once commanded respect through his physical presence began to show the wear of age and confinement. His hair grayed and then whitened. His features became gaunt. His movements slowed. The British provided adequate nutrition and medical care, but no diet and no doctor could compensate for the loss of freedom, for the absence of purpose, for the grinding awareness that the world beyond the prison walls was moving forward, while he remained suspended in stasis. Visitors came occasionally, Red Cross inspectors, government officials, Allied representatives who needed to assess his condition. Each visitor presumably saw the same thing: an aging man in a cell, neither hero nor villain anymore, simply a relic of a regime that was actively dying. As 1944 turned toward 1945, the end of the war came into view. The Allies landed in Normandy in June of 1944 and began their liberation of Western Europe. The Soviet armies advanced from the east. Germany contracted month by month, territory shrinking, cities falling, populations displaced in vast migrations of flight and desperation. Hitler's regime was entering its final convulsions. The Führer himself was retreating into his bunker in Berlin, surrounded by the last faithful followers, making increasingly desperate military decisions based on forces that no longer existed. And Rudolf Hess, the man who had once been essential to Hitler's inner circle, was in a prison camp in Britain, reading newspapers that carried news of Germany's destruction. He had wanted to negotiate peace to preserve Germany. Instead, he had removed himself from Germany at the precise moment when Germany was ceasing to exist as a coherent nation-state. The war ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Berlin fell to the Soviets. Hitler died in his bunker, along with most of his remaining leadership. The Nazi state, which had promised to last 1,000 years, collapsed in less than 13. And Hess remained imprisoned, now in a British facility, waiting to learn his fate. He had been a prisoner of war. Now he would become a prisoner of history. By 1944, Rudolf Hess existed in a state of profound detachment from the world that had created him. Locked away in various cells across Britain, he remained a prisoner of war in name, though the reality was far more complicated. The man who had once stood at Hitler's shoulder, who had shaped the architecture of Nazi loyalty itself, now occupied a peculiar limbo between captive and bargaining chip. Outside the prison walls, the Reich he had helped construct was collapsing with a speed that would have seemed impossible just months before. Hess could only imagine these events through fragmented reports, unreliable intelligence briefings, and the whispered conversations of his guards. The irony was both bitter and complete. The deputy Führer, stripped of his title and authority, was entirely absent from the final reckoning of the Thousand-Year Reich. The year 1943 had marked the beginning of the end, though few in the Nazi hierarchy would admit it then. The defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 shattered the myth of German invincibility that had sustained the regime since 1939. More than 500,000 German soldiers lay dead in the frozen rubble of that city, and for the first time, the German people understood that total victory was no longer possible. From his cell, Hess could only absorb the news in fragments, each report a further confirmation of the catastrophe he had predicted and then tried, in his own desperate way, to prevent. The man who had flown towards Scotland hoping to negotiate an honourable peace now watched as that peace became impossible, as the Allies demanded nothing less than unconditional surrender. Hitler, learning of Hess's capture, had declared him a madman, a traitor even, as if disowning his former deputy could somehow erase the years of absolute loyalty that had come before. The year 1944 brought accelerating devastation to German soil. The Allies launched their invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June, establishing a foothold in Western Europe that could not be dislodged. The massive bombing campaigns against German cities intensified throughout the year, transforming Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and a dozen other cities into infernos that consumed hundreds of thousands of civilians. From his confinement, Hess followed these developments through whatever means British intelligence permitted him to know. He had once believed that his flight to Scotland could prevent this very nightmare, that somehow the British could be separated from the Soviets, that Germany could negotiate its way out of the war it had started. Instead, he was locked away while the consequences of his own regime's decisions rained down on the German people. The man who had drafted the Nuremberg laws, who had propagandized for expansion and autarky and racial supremacy, was now powerless to influence anything. Within the bunker in Berlin, Hitler surrounded himself with those few remaining figures who still possessed his absolute confidence. Heinrich Himmler, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Albert Speer, and a handful of others dominated the final councils of the Reich. Hess's role as deputy Führer had been rendered entirely ceremonial by 1940, and by 1944, it was as though he had never existed at all in the calculations of power. Martin Bormann, a rival and ambitious functionary, had filled much of the vacuum that Hess's absence created, becoming Hitler's secretary and increasing his influence in the final chaotic months. The inner circle that Hess had once carefully arranged and mediated had transformed into a cabal of warmongers, ideologues, and militarists who saw only struggle to the bitter end. Hitler himself had become increasingly isolated, addicted to medication administered by his physician, living in underground shelters, his connection to reality fraying with each passing week. The summer of 1944 brought the first serious attempt on Hitler's life. On the 20th of July, a group of Wehrmacht officers and conservative conspirators detonated a bomb beneath Hitler's conference table at his headquarters in East Prussia. The plot failed to kill him, and in the savage reprisals that followed, hundreds of suspects were arrested, tortured, and executed. From his British cell, Hess learned of these events with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of him might have recognized in these conspirators a reflection of his own desperate flight to Scotland, an attempt to save Germany from the abyss. Yet he was also bound to Hitler by ties so deep that even failure and betrayal could not entirely sever them. He had built his entire identity around absolute loyalty to the Führer, and that loyalty, however misplaced, remained embedded in his consciousness even as he watched from captivity the death throes of the regime he had served. Through the autumn of 1944, the military situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The Red Army, which had turned the tide at Stalingrad and Kursk, now advanced relentlessly westward, liberating Soviet territory and pushing toward Poland and Germany itself. American and British forces broke out of Normandy, liberated Paris in August, and drove toward the Rhine. Germany's allies collapsed one by one. Romania switched sides in August, Bulgaria in September, Hungary in the autumn. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military machine in the world, found itself fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with superior numbers, superior industrial capacity, and seemingly unlimited supplies. Hess, receiving whatever news his captors permitted him to hear, could only contemplate the magnitude of the disaster. The man who had once believed that aviation could secure victory, that loyalty could transcend politics, that peace could be negotiated with honor, now sat powerless while the machinery of war ground toward its conclusion. The winter of 1944 into 1945 brought the final German offensive in the West, the Ardennes counter-offensive, which lasted from December into January. For a brief moment, Hitler believed he could still somehow split the Western Allies, could still achieve a stalemate that might allow him to negotiate. The offensive failed entirely, and Germany's last reserves were consumed in futile struggle. The Soviets, meanwhile, launched their own massive winter offensives, and by the middle of January 1945, Soviet forces were within roughly 80 kilometers of Berlin. The pace of German collapse accelerated towards something approaching free fall. Every day brought fresh disasters, cities falling, soldiers surrendering, refugees streaming westward in panic before the Soviet advance. Hess, isolated in his cell, could only imagine the scale of suffering, the chaos consuming his homeland, the utter failure of everything he had devoted his adult life to achieving. The final months of the war witnessed a macabre continuation of Nazi ideology even as the physical state crumbled around it. Hitler remained obsessed with racial purity and ideological correctness even as Soviet tanks approached his bunker. He continued to issue orders for the execution of those he deemed traitors or defeatists, even as those orders became increasingly meaningless. The concentration camps, which Hess had never been directly forced to acknowledge or defend, continued their industrial slaughter right up until the moment of liberation. Hess had been deputy Führer when the machinery of genocide expanded across Europe, when the regime began implementing policies that would claim 6 million Jewish lives. He had signed or countersigned dozens of decrees and regulations in his official capacity, his name appearing on documents that facilitated persecution and murder. Now, locked away from the world, he could not escape his complicity even as physical distance separated him from the final manifestations of the evil he had helped set in motion. By April 1945, the end was measured not in months or weeks, but in days and hours. Soviet forces entered Berlin on the 16th of April, and the battle for the German capital began. Hitler, refusing to surrender, remained in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing final orders to defend positions that no longer existed. Himmler attempted secret negotiations with the Swedish Red Cross, hoping to broker a separate peace. Goering sent a telegram suggesting he assume leadership of the Reich, an action that enraged Hitler even in these final moments. Bormann, Goebbels, and a few remaining faithful counseled continued resistance or negotiated surrender. The regime that had seemed like it would last 1,000 years was collapsing in genuine chaos and confusion, a far cry from the ordered totalitarianism that Hess had once helped administer. The deputy Führer, meanwhile, remained in his cell, entirely absent from these final dramatic moments, his presence and influence equally absent from the calculations of power. On the 30th of April 1945, as Soviet artillery crashed against the bunker itself, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun and then shot himself. He had ordered his body burned, and Goebbels and his family followed him in death shortly thereafter. The fall of Berlin came over the next several days, with the last German defenders surrendering on the 2nd of May. The regime that had plunged the world into the most catastrophic war in human history, that had inaugurated the industrial genocide of entire peoples, that had transformed Europe into a charnel house, simply ceased to exist. Hess, the man who had been deputy Führer, who had shaped the party's organization and ideology, who had been Hitler's closest confidant for more than a decade, was not present for any of this. He was locked in a British cell, unable to influence events, unable even to understand fully what was happening. His great rival for Hitler's attention, the regime and the future, had ended without him. The contrast between Hess's fate and the collapse of the Reich created a peculiar historical irony that only becomes apparent in retrospect. Those who remained closest to Hitler through the final months were consumed by the same catastrophe they had created. They died in bunkers, died in combat, died by suicide, died in subsequent executions. Speer, who had overseen the war economy, faced trial and decades of imprisonment. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, was executed at Nuremberg. Bormann, Hess's great rival, vanished in the chaos of Berlin's fall, leaving only rumors and speculation about his final moments. Yet Hess, having been removed from the corridors of power by his own reckless act of attempted peacemaking, survived the war itself. His isolation, his captivity, his irrelevance to the final decisions of the Reich had paradoxically preserved his life. He would be tried for his crimes, convicted and imprisoned, but he would live, transformed into a symbol of Nazi delusion and the price of loyalty to tyranny. The final weeks of the war also revealed the true nature of the regime that Hess had served with such unwavering devotion. As the Allies advanced, they discovered the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the mass graves, the systematic machinery of murder that had operated throughout the war. They found documentation of the genocide, testimonies from survivors, physical evidence of atrocities on a scale that exceeded even the darkest rumors that had circulated during the war years. Hess, in his cell, would eventually be forced to confront the reality of what his regime had done, what his loyalty had enabled, what his propagandist speeches had justified. The man who had preached German racial superiority, who had helped craft the legal framework for persecution, who had delivered fiery orations celebrating the will to power and the struggle for national greatness, now faced the reckoning for words and actions transformed into mountains of corpses. As Germany surrendered unconditionally on the 7th of May 1945, ending the war in Europe, Hess remained imprisoned in Britain, contemplating a future that had been entirely transformed. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted exactly 12 years, consuming tens of millions of lives, reducing great cities to rubble, and leaving behind a continental wasteland of grief and trauma. The man who had flown to Scotland believing he could negotiate a separate peace, who had thought himself indispensable to the regime's future, who had imagined his mission would reshape the course of history, now sat in a cell comprehending the totality of his miscalculation. His absence from the final catastrophe was not a mercy, but another dimension of his failure, another irony layered upon the many ironies that defined his strange, diminished existence. The deputy Führer had become irrelevant to the very regime he had devoted his entire adult life to building, serving, and extending. History had passed him by, leaving him in captivity to await a judgment that would define the remainder of his life. The war that Rudolf Hess tried to prevent had consumed Europe in fire and blood. By the time German forces surrendered unconditionally on the 7th of May 1945, more than 60 million people had perished in the conflict he had once believed he could stop through a single flight across the North Sea. Hess emerged from years of captivity as an anachronism, a relic of Nazi power preserved in British custody, while the regime itself crumbled into rubble and ash. The man who had once stood at Hitler's shoulder, whispering counsel in the intimate chambers of power, was now a prisoner whose very existence posed a unique problem for the victorious Allies. They could not simply execute him without trial, not if they intended to establish a new international order based on law rather than vengeance. And so began the process that would bring Hess, along with the surviving architects of the Third Reich, before a tribunal that aimed to hold the Nazi leadership accountable not just for military defeat, but for the systematic machinery of evil they had constructed and maintained. The Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal convened in the autumn of 1945 in a courtroom in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg itself, a city that had hosted the regime's most grandiose rallies, where hundreds of thousands had gathered to celebrate Nazi ideology with choreographed precision. Now the same German city would become the stage for its reckoning. The courtroom was a symbolic choice, a place where the victors could demonstrate that the rule of law would prevail where tyranny had once reigned. Hess was transferred from British military custody to the hands of the International Tribunal, joining other surviving Nazi leaders in the dock: Hermann Göring, Rudolf Himmler's adjutants, Albert Speer, and others who had occupied positions of power and complicity within the regime. The prosecution came from 4 victorious nations: the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. Each had lost millions to the Nazi war machine, and each brought its own perspective on how justice should be administered. The proceedings would stretch from November 1945 through September 1946, a massive undertaking that would examine not just individual crimes, but the entire apparatus of Nazi governance and warfare. The charges against Hess were specific and grave: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, and conspiracy to commit war crimes. Unlike some of his former colleagues, Hess was not charged with crimes against humanity or direct responsibility for the death camps, though his role in the regime that had conceived and executed the Holocaust remained undeniable. The prosecution's case focused on his political influence during the pre-war years, when Hitler still harbored ambitions for negotiation alongside rearmament, when the Nazi leadership was still calculating which nations might be intimidated or seduced into acquiescence rather than confronted militarily. Hess's speeches and writings from the 1930s were entered into evidence, documents that revealed his function as ideological propagandist and enforcer of party discipline. His role in establishing the hierarchy of the Nazi Party, in mediating disputes among powerful subordinates, in ensuring that loyalty to Hitler flowed downward through every level of the regime, all of this was meticulously documented and presented. The prosecution sought to demonstrate that Hess, though increasingly marginalized after 1938, had been instrumental in creating the conditions that made Nazi aggressive expansion possible. The testimony revealed an unsettling truth about Hess's position within the regime. He had been powerful precisely because he was weak-willed, loyal precisely because he lacked independent moral judgment, influential precisely because he possessed no vision beyond unwavering devotion to Hitler's person. Former Nazi officials testified about how Hess had operated in the years of consolidation following the seizure of power. He had eliminated rivals within the party, enforced ideological conformity, and served as an extension of Hitler's will throughout the apparatus of state and party. Witnesses described how Hess had mediated between competing factions, ensuring that Hitler remained at the apex of power by playing subordinates against one another. He had controlled access to the Führer, determining who could speak to Hitler and on what terms. In the pre-war years, when Hitler was still manufacturing crises as pretexts for expansion rather than openly announcing his intentions, Hess had been the guardian of that carefully constructed facade, the enforcer of the propaganda line that German rearmament was purely defensive, that Hitler wanted only to correct the injustices of Versailles. These were not crimes of passion or ideological fervor, but crimes of calculation, the careful construction of machinery designed to serve tyranny. The defense presented by Hess himself revealed the depths of his self-deception and the psychological barriers that prevented him from confronting his own complicity. Hess testified that he had been acting independently, without Hitler's authorization, when he flew to Scotland in 1941. He maintained this fiction even as evidence showed that Hitler had built an entire apparatus of party and state with Hess as a central mechanism, that Hess had known the military capabilities of the regime intimately because of his access to Hitler, that his peace proposals had been predicated on knowledge that only an insider could possess. Hess claimed that his role had been purely administrative, that he had merely implemented Hitler's orders without forming his own judgments about their morality or legality. When confronted with his own speeches, in which he had articulated the racial ideology of Nazism with clarity and conviction, Hess suggested that he had been merely mouthing the words that his Führer wished to hear. This line of defense, that he was not really responsible because he was only loyal, struck at the heart of what Nuremberg was attempting to establish, that loyalty to a criminal regime conferred no moral protection, that obedience to illegal orders was itself a crime. The evidence presented regarding Hess's propaganda activities was particularly damning because it showed that he had not been a passive functionary but an active architect of the ideological machinery that made the regime possible. Hess had delivered speeches at the Nuremberg rallies where the regime's racial ideology had been articulated to hundreds of thousands of party members. He had written and signed documents establishing the organizational structure that made it possible for the Nazi Party to operate as the controlling mechanism of German society. He had endorsed the dismissal of Jews from the civil service, the exclusion of Jewish students from universities, the entire apparatus of legal discrimination that preceded and enabled the systematic genocide that followed. He had not personally wielded the knife or pulled the trigger, but his hands were not clean. The prosecution argued that Hess's crime was one of enabling, that he had constructed the machine that once built could be directed toward any purpose that Hitler desired. His loyalty was not mitigating but aggravating, because he had been a willing participant in the construction of a regime designed for aggression and domination. One of the most striking aspects of Hess's testimony was his apparent inability to grasp the moral dimension of his actions. When confronted with descriptions of atrocities committed by the regime he had helped construct, Hess would claim ignorance or deny personal knowledge. Yet the evidence showed that within the Nazi Party hierarchy, such denials stretched credulity to the breaking point. Hess had access to Hitler. He knew the intentions of the regime. He had helped to articulate those intentions in speeches and writings. If he truly did not know of the concentration camps, the racial murders, the industrial-scale genocide that the regime was perpetrating, his ignorance was not the result of lack of access to information, but of willful blindness, of a deliberate choice not to see what he did not wish to confront. The tribunal was not impressed. The judges recognized that Hess's ignorance, real or performed, could not erase his responsibility for having constructed the apparatus that made such crimes possible. A regime of laws had been replaced with a regime of terror, and Hess had been the instrument through which that replacement had been accomplished. The prosecution also focused on Hess's role in the expansion of Nazi power into Austria and Czechoslovakia during the late 1930s. Though Hess had not formulated these policies himself, he had been instrumental in ensuring that they were executed with the coordinated loyalty of the entire party apparatus. He had used his influence over the party structure to suppress dissent, to promote those who showed unwavering support for Hitler's aggressive expansion, and to marginalize those who harbored doubts. The annexation of Austria and the occupation of the Sudetenland had been greeted with carefully orchestrated enthusiasm throughout the party apparatus, enthusiasm that Hess had helped to manufacture and enforce. When Hitler decided to move against Czechoslovakia, it was the party apparatus controlled by Hess that had helped to make that expansion possible. Without such control, without the coordination of party loyalty, Hitler's ambitions could not have been realized. Hess bore responsibility not for conceiving these expansionist schemes, but for providing the organizational and ideological machinery that made them possible. As the trial progressed through the winter and spring of 1946, a clear picture emerged from the testimony and evidence. Hess had been not a great thinker or visionary, but a functionary of profound talent and complete moral vacancy. He had possessed the administrative genius necessary to weld the Nazi Party into an effective instrument of control, yet he had lacked the independent moral judgment to question the purposes to which that instrument was being directed. He had been, in the language of political philosophy, a totalitarian personality, a man who found meaning and purpose entirely in obedience to a leader who embodied, in his mind, all authority and all legitimacy. This type of personality, the tribunal came to understand, was not unique to Hess. It was, in fact, the type of personality that totalitarian regimes required in order to function effectively. The system depended on men like Hess, intelligent, capable, yet willing to subordinate their own judgment entirely to the will of the leader. The implications were disturbing. Such men could not be dismissed as aberrations or monsters. They were, in a sense, the natural products of the regime they served. The closing arguments of the prosecution presented a carefully constructed argument about the nature of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. The prosecution argued that Hess, by virtue of his position and his actions, bore personal responsibility for the aggressive wars launched by Nazi Germany. He had helped to create the ideological justification for those wars. He had helped to organize the party apparatus that made them possible, and he had known, or ought to have known, that the purposes to which his talents were being directed were fundamentally criminal. The prosecution did not argue that Hess had ordered the invasions of Poland or the Soviet Union. Those decisions had been made by Hitler and the military high command. But Hess had created the conditions, the apparatus, and the ideological framework that made those invasions possible and conceivable. His crime was one of contribution, of complicity, of having willingly placed his talents at the service of a regime whose fundamental purposes were criminal. The prosecution reminded the tribunal that the entire edifice of international law that the tribunal itself represented was predicated on the idea that individuals could be held responsible for their choices, that claiming to have merely followed orders or to have merely served a leader could not absolve one of moral and legal responsibility. The defense arguments, by contrast, attempted to minimize Hess's actual power and influence, to characterize him as a figurehead whose role had been largely ceremonial by the time war actually began. The defense pointed to the evidence that Hess's influence had declined after 1938, that military and SS factions had come to dominate Hitler's attention, that Hess had been effectively sidelined from major policy decisions in the years immediately preceding the war. The defense also attempted to distinguish between Hess's pre-war role, which it acknowledged had involved propaganda and party organization, and any alleged responsibility for the actual crimes committed during the war. This attempted distinction failed to impress the tribunal. The judges understood that the crimes against peace, the aggressive wars launched by Nazi Germany, had their origins in the pre-war period, in the expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia, in the systematic rejection of the post-World War I international order that Hess had helped to justify and orchestrate. His declining influence after 1938 did not erase his responsibility for having constructed the apparatus that made Nazi aggression possible. As the trial drew toward its conclusion in the late spring of 1946, it became clear that Hess would not escape accountability. The tribunal had listened to months of testimony, examined thousands of documents, and heard from survivors and witnesses who could attest to the nature and scope of Nazi crimes. Hess's position as deputy Führer, his intimate access to Hitler, his role in party propaganda, his involvement in the expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia, all of this made him a central figure in the regime's machinery of aggression, even if he had not personally formulated the major decisions. The tribunal recognized that individuals could be held accountable not merely for direct orders or personal participation in violence, but for their role in constructing and maintaining the systems through which such violence became possible. Hess's case represented a new development in international law, the idea that those who facilitate and enable criminal regimes could themselves be prosecuted and punished for crimes against peace. In the final days before sentencing, Hess attempted one last appeal to the tribunal, arguing that he had been misunderstood, that his loyalty to Hitler had been a virtue rather than a vice, that he had served his country honorably within the context of the regime he had inherited. The tribunal listened without sympathy. The judges understood that Hess's fundamental error and his fundamental crime had been his inability or unwillingness to question the nature of the regime he served, his conviction that loyalty to Hitler was the highest good, his willingness to place his considerable talents entirely at the service of a leader and a regime whose purposes were fundamentally criminal. As the tribunal prepared its verdicts and sentences, it became clear that Hess would be held accountable not for what he had done under orders, but for what he had done willingly, deliberately, and with full knowledge of his power to refuse. The reckoning was coming. #The verdict. The courtroom at Nuremberg was designed with one purpose in mind: to hold the architects of the Third Reich accountable before the eyes of the world. By the autumn of 1945, the physical and moral wreckage of Nazi Germany lay exposed across Europe, concentration camps liberated and their horrors documented, cities reduced to rubble, millions dead. The trial of the major war criminals began on the 20th of November 1945 in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, a city itself symbolically chosen because it had been the spiritual center of Nazi pageantry and ideology. The courtroom was modern, businesslike, stripped of the theatricality that characterized so much of Nazi stagecraft. No swastikas hung from the walls, no uniforms were permitted, just evidence, testimony, documents, and the pale faces of men who had held absolute power only months before. Rudolf Hess sat in the dock alongside Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and 19 other senior Nazi officials and military leaders. He was no longer the deputy Führer, no longer the man with the power to make or break careers within the party machinery. He was prisoner number 7, wearing a grey prison uniform, his once dark hair now streaked with grey, his face bearing the mark of 4 years in captivity. The prosecution's case against Hess was methodical and unrelenting. The American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, presented evidence of Hess's role as deputy Führer from 1933 onward, documenting his participation in the consolidation of Nazi power, his key position in the party hierarchy, and his function as an enforcer of Hitler's will within the regime's internal structures. Documents were presented showing Hess's involvement in party affairs, his authority over Nazi organizations, and his presence at the highest levels of decision-making throughout the 1930s. The prosecution did not attempt to prove that Hess personally orchestrated mass murder. That was not necessary. Their charge was conspiracy. The allegation that Hess, as a member of the Nazi leadership, had conspired to wage aggressive war, to dominate Europe through conquest, and to establish a totalitarian state built on terror and racial ideology. They argued that his position at Hitler's side meant he was party to all of these plans, that his loyalty to Hitler made him complicit in everything the regime had done. The physical evidence was staggering. Film footage of Nazi rallies where Hess stood prominently beside the Führer, documents bearing his signature authorizing party actions, testimony from former subordinates detailing his orders and directives, transcripts of speeches he had delivered promoting Nazi ideology to audiences